Hello and welcome to the second True Crime Man's Dark Imagination Marathon of 2022. I'm Alan Gotro and I'm your host. We chose these episodes for this marathon that subscribers suggested overwhelmingly, and we hope you enjoy. If you like what you saw, hit the subscribe button, the like button, and the bell so that you won't miss out on any future programs. Also, please share us with your friends who enjoy historical crime renditions. And now for the marathon.
Our story concerns the prosperity of an immigrant and the hard-working recent arrivals to the French Quarter of the city. Even though these dedicated entrepreneurs managed to climb the economic ladder to providing a better life for their families, a better life than they would have had in their native lands, still, this was the tincture of jealousy among the Italian population, and especially through a criminal underbelly that preyed upon their own countrymen. For the Lamana family, the streets of gold paving the new world meant a sacrifice that any parent would dread, and exposed the dark side of immigration and dastardly crimes within the city known as the Big Easy. Italians had been a part of the New Orleans mystique since the founding of the colony by the French in 1718. Throughout time, the Italians made a substantial contribution to the development of the local fabric. But, although the Italian people contributed greatly to the culture of the region, stereotypical portraits began to emerge in the late 19th century and proved not only detrimental to Italian assimilation into American society, but also the Italian people as an inherently criminal ethnicity. It was the whites' belief in the criminality of Italians that justified the violent bias and prejudice against the Mediterranean ethnicity. Despite the widespread belief that all Italians had some affiliation with an underworld criminal enterprise, there were those who strived to break free of the dark cloud that hanged over the Italian people as a whole. Peter Lamana was one of the early immigrants to struggle and finally succeed at his chosen profession, undertaker. In the early evening of June 8, 1907, Mrs. Peter Lamana called all of her children to the table for the nightly family dinner. Despite the merciless heat and humidity of New Orleans summers, children of the city cherished the time of endless play, running around the local neighborhoods in bare feet. When Mrs. Lamana noticed that her son did not respond to her first call, she wailed again to see if perhaps he was near. An hour passed, then another, and still no little Walter. A local search party scoured the neighborhood in search of the 7-year-old, but to no avail. Peter Lamana, Walter's father, believed that perhaps his youngest son fell asleep in one of the wagons and the driver never noticed the tyke in the back. Or perhaps Walter had secreted off to visit his favorite uncle near the Lake Pontchartrain lakefront. This later turned out to be untrue. Walter was nowhere to be found. Mr. Lamana then contacted the police and a full-scale search commenced. Every house in the French Quarter opened their doors and gates to their courtyards, but still no Walter. Days went by and authorities asked Peter Lamana if there had been any demands for ransom. Mr. Lamana stated that no ransom demand had ever come to his residence. However, he related an incident 2 years earlier during the deadly yellow fever epidemic of 1905. A strange visitor rang the bell at the Lamana residence at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning. A young black man handed Mr. Lamana a note. The barely awake undertaker unfolded the note, read it to himself, and then asked the young man who'd sent it. The young man then turned to leave without answering the question. Mr. Lamana then threatened the young man that if he saw him again, Lamana would kill him. Despite no demand for a ransom to return little Walter, the local newspaper speculated the young boy became a victim of the hated and brutal Mano Nero, or the Black Hand. The Black Hand functioned as a group of enforcers for the local mafiosi, not only in the New Orleans area, but wherever an Italian conclave gathered within the United States. Local merchants would receive a letter from the extortioners threatening to perform a kidnapping, arson, or worse, the murder of a family member. The Black Hand preyed upon their own Italian people with reckless abandon. Because of Lamana's reasonable modicum of success, his family would make a prime victim for the ruthless group, as well as other Italians who worked the streets of gold in pursuit of the American dream. Until some proof of the Black Hand's involvement, police suspicions remained just speculation. On June 10th, 1907, Peter Lamana finally received a note, but gave no indication to authorities of its contents. But he did say the letter gave Lamana instructions as to where to find his young son. Later disclosure of the note stated,
Mr. Lamana, we beg of you not to be displeased that your son is missing because he's in good hands. As far as eating, he eats good. Conditions are to send some. We demand a small pay, only $6,000. Certainly you won't miss that, you're a son, because we will send him cut in pieces if you don't send us the money. $6,000.
A second letter from the alleged kidnappers arrived and warned Mr. Lamana not to call the police. Local citizens hypothesized in the newspapers that little Walter had become a victim of the Black Hand, and that authorities and citizens alike needed to finally rid the area of the hated organization. On June 11, 1907, Italian citizens from all over the city met in the Frances Hall, determined to end the reign of the Black Hand in New Orleans. Even though Italians maintained a deep distrust for authorities, most of them knew that if they did not identify the culprits in the kidnapping of Walter Lamana, the terror would continue. Judge Philip J. Patorno, an influential member of the legal community in New Orleans, accused the police and their detectives of not being aggressive enough to find Walter Lamana. Patorno blamed the police department for not hiring enough Italian detectives, who the citizenry would trust enough to divulge any information. As a result of the meeting, the Italian Vigilance Committee formed and vowed to search for the young Walter in a move uncharacteristic of the population, cooperate fully with the authorities in search of the missing child. While the Italian Vigilance Committee met and determined a course of action, Peter Lamana asked that some police officers go with him and try to meet the conditions set forth in the ransom notes. The small group of men set forth to Kenner, Louisiana, a small Italian conclave on the outskirts of New Orleans, where they were joined by more officers determined to find the young boy. The large search party then set off towards St. Charles Parish, where Mr. Lamana was to meet a man and receive further instructions. The entire sojourn produced nothing, and Peter Lamana returned to his home without his son, much to the grief and disappointment of his bereaved wife. On the morning of June 12, 1907, Peter Lamana awoke, after a most harrowing day before, to the news that a local mafia chieftain, Tony Acosta, was seen by witnesses with young Walter on the day of the child's disappearance. A frantic search ensued to find the elusive Acosta. The Italian Vigilance Committee moved to find the perpetrators of the Lamana kidnapping and assisted the police in rounding up the usual suspects. They felt that, among this number, they have the Black Hand artists who have been making life a burden for them and are implicated in the kidnapping of the boy, Walter Lamana, who is still in the hands of the villains. The acting mayor of New Orleans, James McCracken, emphasized to the Vigilance Committee that any questioning to be done would be executed with authorities present. The more heinous the crime, the more the rights of the accused would have to be protected. Fears among the Italians pervade, Most remembered what happened to the men accused of murdering police chief David C. Hennessy. A jury found the defendants in the murder trial in 1891
not guilty,
and this in turn caused a mass meeting where, after being whipped into a frenzy, 10,000 people rushed to the old parish prison and lynched many of the men who, although acquitted of murdering Chief Hennessy, authorities brought them into the prison for their protection. The lynching caused an international incident, and for a time, the United States and Italy stood on the verge of an all-out war. The Italian government tried to claim that some of the murdered men were Italian citizens. In an act to avoid war, the United States paid an indemnity to the families of the murdered men. Still, Italians feared that someone accused of a crime may be dragged from a cell in the middle of the night and dispatched very quickly. Later, in 1896 and 1899, 9 more Italians thought to be with the mafia were lynched without a trial. With the most recent past, the Italian consternation over trusting the authorities was understandable. But now, the whites of New Orleans demonstrated a sense of community as even the most successful citizen joined in the search for Walter Lamana. With few suspects being questioned and authorities actively searching for Tony Costa, Italians in the area learned that the wily gangster was hiding in plain sight. On June 14, 1907, Judge Patorno, who had taken a leading role in the apprehension of anyone who may have been involved in the kidnapping, went to Costa's residence with 2 police officers. As the group approached the front stoop, they noticed a young girl who ran inside when she saw Patorno and the officers approaching. Patorno and the officer's escort hurried across the street to the Costa residence and drew their weapons. They ran up the stairs and into Costa's room, where he struggled to get out of his bed. Patorno shoved the man back down, held a pistol over the suspect's heart, and dared him to move. The police took Costa into custody. During his questioning, the police made mention that several witnesses stated they saw Costa with little Walter on the day of the child's disappearance when he bought some ice cream for the tyke. During the interrogation, the police also arrested an associate of Costa's, Anthony Sclafani. At the suggestion of District Attorney Chandler Lusenberg, police released all of the suspects with the exception of Costa. Although the suspects released walked away from the police station, apparently unmolested, the police placed full surveillance on them on a 24-hour basis. As Costa sat in jail, one of Costa's associates came forward and provided an affidavit asserting that Costa masterminded the kidnapping of Walter Lamana. On June 16, 1907, police then formally arrested the reputed mafia leader with the kidnapping of the 7-year-old, and then searched for accomplices. In order to keep Costa from communicating with any associates on the outside, police isolated Costa so no information could come from the jail. Police theorized that Ignazio Campisciano provided a wagon with which to secret Walter out of the city. Campisciano then delivered the boy somewhere between Kenner and St. Rose, Louisiana, where the initial search began, and placed the little boy on a small boat to transport their quarry to the west bank of the Mississippi River. Because of his rendition of what happened to young Walter, police arrested Campisciano as a principal accomplice in the crime. The day after Costa's arrest, he received a very interesting visitor. Peter Lamana and Detective John D'Antonio arrived at Costa's cell in the parish prison for a confrontation. Confronted with the potential victim's father, Costa maintained that he did not hurt anyone in Lamana's family and did not know where his son may be. Although Acosta admitted he took Walter to the ice cream shop, he swore he left the boy at approximately 7:45 p.m. on the night of the kidnapping. As he turned to leave the cell, Costa pleaded fervently that he had nothing to do with the little boy's disappearance. Lamana showed no reaction as he left the cell, and finally, the prison. On June 18, 1907, Peter Lamana received another letter that hinted toward a man named Giovanni Barreca, held information as to the whereabouts of his son and the particulars of the plan. After reading the letter, Lamana made a statement to the local press. "I shall never see my son again. I could not believe that men could be so cruel. I have lost all faith in my brothers, and all that I can see ahead is years of suffering and misery and perhaps a maniac's cell. If I only knew that poor little Walter was dead, my heart would not be so heavy. but the feeling that he is in the hands, at the black legs, and perhaps being ill-treated and tortured is driving me mad. At dawn, on the morning of June 23, 1907, police officers accompanied by Capesciano searched the woods and swamps located near St. Rose, Louisiana. After an hour of silence, Capesciano, sitting on a log with shackles on his hands and feet, confessed to the crime of kidnapping Walter Lamana and then pointed the way to where little Walter could be located. After wading through waist-deep water, Capesciano led the authorities to the headless torso of a young boy wrapped in a blanket. Dr. Joseph O'Hare, the coroner for Orleans Parish, verified the remains as those of Walter Lamana. The torso lacked the arms, legs, and the head. The rest of the body would be located a few moments later with no doubt as to the identity. Capesciano related what happened the day of Walter's disappearance. The young boy began to cry once the kidnappers brought him to the Capesciano cabin in the woods near St. Rose. Of the 4 other accomplices that Capesciano identified, one of them grabbed the boy and strangled him to death after Walter refused to cease his crying. Then, the accomplices made the decision to dismember the body and dispose of it in the woods. Police learned that the kidnappers lured Walter away from his home with promises of sweets. The coroner determined that young Walter must have suffered greatly prior to expiring. After news of the discovery reached the local population, a witness came forward by the name of Jenny Garifo and stated that she had witnessed Walter at the Capesciano cabin, and one of the accomplices warned her to keep her mouth shut about what she saw or she would disappear. But when it appeared that authorities broke the conspiracy, this brave young woman came forward. On June 24, 1907, with the information as to the culprits in hand, authorities arrested Lorenzo Giambeluca, Leonard Gebbia, and Tony Gendusa, all suspects of belonging to the mafia in New Orleans. Giuseppe Cattisano and Mrs. Marie Capesciano are arrested as well. 3 others, Angelo Incacataro, Francesco Lucchesi, and Stefano Monfrey, fled the jurisdiction when they learned of warrants for their arrest. Because of the volatile atmosphere surrounding the case, then Governor of Louisiana Newton C. Blanchard vowed to keep order and not have a repeat of the 1891 incident by placing the state militia on alert and ready to quell any disturbance. Governor Blanchard believed in innocent until proven guilty. The police arrested Angelo Montelone, Gebby's brother-in-law, and Gebby's sister, Nicolina Gebby. Police believe that Francesco Lucchesi hatched the plot to kidnap the young Walter because he wanted the money to marry Nicola Gebbia. Police further deduced that Frank Gedusa wrote the Black Hand Notes. Once word that the police made the arrests in the kidnapping and murder of his son, Peter Lamana rushed to the Gretna jailhouse to confront the suspects. He swore that if the courts did not dispense justice in his son's case, he would do the job himself. Once the suspects were held in custody, Jenny Garifo elaborated on her initial facts. She stated she awoke on Sunday morning after the kidnapping and had to cut wood in order to make coffee for her father. While in the yard, she noticed 2 Italian men in Capesciano's yard, and one of the men held the hand of a little boy. The 2 men then took the young boy into Capesciano's cabin. Later that same day, Ms. Garifo witnessed another man walk into the cabin, and then she heard the loud cries of the young child. The next day, Ms. Garifo stated she no longer heard the child's cries. Police later searched the Capesciano cabin and found a small hatchet that appeared to have bloodstains on it and a rope that appeared to have been used. Mrs. Capesciano acted as a lookout while Walter sat in the cabin. When the police questioned Mrs. Capesciano further, she divulged that her husband and his co-conspirators planned to kidnap 3 children, those of well-to-do Italians in and around New Orleans. On July 4th, the suspects then became defendants in the kidnapping and murder of Walter Lamana. Appointed as their counsel, L. Robert Rivard realized he had a tough road ahead of him to defend the accused kidnappers/murderers. Costa would prove even more difficult to defend because he would not assist in his defense. Additionally, Costa attempted to kill himself by rolling up a handkerchief to hang himself. The effort proved unsuccessful. One of the most emotional incidents of the trial came when Mrs. Lamana came to the stand and cursed the defendants. Their heads hung low, finally showing some sort of remorse. She fainted as she left the stand when she noticed the bloody clothes that Walter wore the day of the kidnapping appear as an exhibit on the prosecution's table. Also during the trial, Leonard Gebbie desired to turn state's evidence and wanted to testify against his co-conspirators. The prosecution agreed to the testimony provided that Gebbia would be completely truthful in his rendition of the events. Gebbia agreed and stated that he overheard a conversation between Campisciano and a man named Joe Di Paella, who owned a farm close to the Campiscianos. Police arrested Di Paella later after the initial arrest of the accomplices. Gebbia witnessed Di Paella and Campisciano exchanging some words, and when he moved closer to hear more of the conversation, Di Paella fell to his knees and begged Campisciano, "For Christ's sake, don't give away on me." Campisciano commanded Di Paella to be quiet and get off his knees, for the guard was returning. Campisciano then replied to Di Paella that, "I'm not going to be hung. My wife is going to get hanged or sent to the penitentiary. What will become of my 2 children? Will you take care of them both and care for them the same as I would if I were in trouble?" Di Paella said, "I swear." Leonardo Gebbia's testimony proved damning to the defense, especially when he mentioned that he witnessed Costa walk off with little Walter from the ice cream shop, walk to the corner of Royale and Dumaine streets, and place the boy in a covered wagon. Jenny Garifo, the witness who placed the principals at the scene of the crime, corroborated Gebbia's testimony. On the second day of the trial, coroner Dr. Joseph O'Hare testified that he examined the remains of Walter Lamana and performed the autopsy on those said remains. When he produced his findings before the court, O'Hare's recitations drew gasps from both the gallery and the jury box. The next witness called by the prosecution was Mrs. Peter Lamana, dressed all in black. Mrs. Lamana stared at the bloody clothing of her dead child that sat on the prosecution's table. As she answered all the questions posed by the prosecution, her tears flowed freely. Mrs. Lamana stood near the end of her testimony and faced the defendants without any prompt and screamed, "You are a bunch of murderers." After regaining her composure from the outburst, Mrs. Lamana continued her testimony by saying that a woman matching the description of Mrs. Gebbia came to her door on the following Sunday after Walter's disappearance and stated that Walter had some ice cream at her house and that some unsavory men held him captive and that her husband should pay the ransom money. Not only did Mrs. Gebbia visit Mrs. Lamana after Walter's disappearance, but the entire Gebbia family managed to pay her a visit as well. Mr. Lamana took the stand next and repeated most of his wife's testimony. He had no outbursts, but Peter Lamana looked like a man overcome with grief, pain, and disbelief as his testimony appeared incoherent at times. But the reaction of the gallery and jury could be felt throughout the entire courtroom as Peter Lamana's voice shook with emotion. After his expressive testimony, both the defense and prosecution rested their cases. Judge Edrington gave the jury their charge and stated that the penalty for murder was death. However, they could add the words "without capital punishment" if they found the defendants guilty as charged. 24 hours after considering all the evidence, the jury found Ignacio Campisciano, Maria Campisciano, Frank Guedusa, and Tony Costa guilty of the kidnapping and murder of Walter Lamana without capital punishment. However, and even though he gave evidence that helped convict the other defendants, Leonardo Gebbia would be tried at a later date along with his sister, Noklina Gebbia, for the same crime. The citizens of the state of Louisiana, especially at this explosive time in the state's history, tended to respond to verdicts of this type with extra-legal justice. The response of the verdict in this case was not different, but law enforcement and government authorities of the state reminded the denizens that no incidents that have occurred in the past under such circumstances would be tolerated. The state militia received a call to protect the defendants, and especially the Gebbias, from any lynchings or jailhouse retribution. Many argued that to the season's criminals, a life sentence meant nothing. The only justice they would understand, and would serve as further warning to perpetrators contemplating the same crime, was nothing short of paying for their travesty with their lives. But detractors of the sentence stated that the jury obviously misunderstood Edrington's instructions to the jury. Nevertheless, the sentence would stand with the exception of one. Although there were cries for lynching, the act never materialized. After the jury's announced verdict, Ignacio Campisciano finally admitted to what actually happened to Walter Lamana. After Peter Lamana refused to pay the $6,000 ransom, Campisciano admitted to strangling the young boy, but never confessed to the dismembering. The convicted murderer firmly believed that with his confession lay a commutation of the sentence for his wife. On November 13, 1907, Leonardo and Nicolina Gebbia stood trial for the kidnapping and murder of Walter Lamana. D.A. Marrero brought Ignacio Campisciani into the courtroom to testify against the Gebbias, although his testimony would not garner any leniency in his sentence. His testimony was limited, however, because Campisciano refused to identify Gebbia as the man who had ordered the death of the small child. As Campisciano left the witness stand, escorted by an armed guard detail, he passed Peter Lamana on the way out of the courtroom. Peter Lamana swore that he would get the opportunity to kill Campisciano at a later date. D.A. Marrero basically presented the same evidence against the Gebbias as he had with the other defendants in the previous trial. After a succinct proceeding, the jury found the Gebbias guilty of capital murder and sentenced the brother and sister to death by hanging. The verdict seemed strange to witnesses at the time due to the minor role the brother and sister played in the entire conspiracy. Nevertheless, those who demonstrated sympathy for the victim's family determined the verdict just and true. Even though authorities believed that the principals responsible for the kidnapping and death of 7-year-old Walter Lamana had received their just due, authorities failed to apprehend the other 4 suspects, and they remained at large. In September of 1908, after denial of their appeal, a concerted petition drive began to commute the sentence of Nicolina Gebbia. 7 months had passed, and in 1909, Louisiana State Board of Pardons granted the commutation of Nicolina's sentence. As for her brother Leonardo, there would be no commutation, and his sentence of death would commence. On July 16, 1909, Governor J.Y. Sanders signed Gebbia's death warrant and slated his execution for that very same day. At 12:30 on a hot July Friday, guards from the St. Charles Parish Jail escorted Leonardo Gebbia, along with his priest, a Father Moret, to the steps of the gallows. Gebbia suffered some of the indignities of a condemned man as the people present in the yard to witness his execution spat upon him and called him a baby killer. He hesitated at the bottom step, and then, as if a wisp of courage entered his small frame, Gebbia walked up the remainder of the 13 steps in the jail yard where he finally met his executioner, H.M. Johns. Johns, as an experienced hangman, placed Gebbia over the trapdoor, tied his legs and feet together, then placed the customary black hood over the condemned man's head. John took the noose and fastened it around Gebbia's neck, making sure that his neck would immediately break as the trap was released. Johns then looked to the sheriff, who gave the signal to release the trapdoor. Gebbia suffered for almost 15 minutes as his neck did not break. Obviously, Johns did not secure the noose as he thought, and Gebbia suffocated to death. Whether Johns did this on purpose has been the topic of much speculation. Nevertheless, Peter Lamana's wish of the suffering of his son's death visited Leonardo Gebbia in his last moments of life.
On March 9, 1950, Timothy John Evans, 25 years old, stood convicted of murdering his young wife Beryl and his infant daughter Geraldine. Evans poised on the gallows and waited for the customary hood after consuming his last meal. As he stood over the trap door, Evans stated that he was innocent. Subsequent to Evans's death, the general public began to question whether Evans was truly guilty and asked the question that if Evans did not murder his wife and child, then who did? The answer as to the true assailant soon became apparent and exposed a most vicious killer. Timothy Evans and his young family lived at 10 Rillington Place, Notting Hill, London, where they moved during Easter of 1948. They lived in a top-floor flat of the building. Shortly after moving there, Beryl Evans, Timothy's young wife, gave birth to a baby girl the couple named Geraldine. In late 1948, Evans reported to the local police that his wife and baby were dead. When the police went to the residence, they found nothing at first. Then they searched the yard. The authorities found the deceased bodies of Geraldine and Beryl Evans in an outside wash house. Beryl's body had been found wrapped in a blanket and then in a tablecloth. An autopsy revealed she had been strangled, but the new mother suffered from a massive beating, judging from the bruises on her face. Mr. Evans, at first, notified authorities that a man in their building had performed a botched abortion on his wife, which resulted in her death. But under intense interrogation, Evans eventually confessed to the murder himself. Eventually, Evans recanted his confession, which most investigators believed to be contrived and coerced, and pointed his finger toward the abortionist. This time, he blamed him for the murder of both his wife Beryl and daughter Geraldine. Investigators seemed undeterred and charged Evans with the murder of his daughter and not his wife. Evans's trial began on January 11, 1950. The principal witness at the trial, a John Reginald Halliday Christie, gave damning evidence that contradicted Evans's claims that he had nothing to do with the deaths of Beryl and Geraldine Evans. Despite the fact that Christie possessed a lengthy criminal record, the defense called into question the credibility of the witness. But the jury found Timothy Evans guilty of murdering his daughter Geraldine, and the court sentenced him to death by hanging. On February 20, 1950, Evans's appeal failed, and the court sentence was carried out. But this was not the end of the story. The authorities believed they had the murderer, but during their search of the yard at the house located at 10 Rillington Place, they discovered several other things that they did not readily question at the time. For instance, a human femur was found to be propping up a fence. Several visible bones appeared on the ground during the search where police searched the yard. A human skull had been unearthed by a dog immediately after the authorities allegedly completed their searches of the yard. It became clear that authorities did not execute the search with any clarity, and it proved superficial. Had the police exhibited any forensic diligence, they would have noticed one individual who acted peculiarly and seemed eager to convict another for the crimes he himself committed. As the case went on, observers believed that Evans's confession had been extracted through coercion and duress. Various interviews conducted demonstrated that Evans was unaware exactly where his wife was buried. He also claimed that her body parts would appear in the drain located at the front of the residence. When police searched the drain, they found no human remains whatsoever. Evans was also unaware that his daughter had been murdered along with his wife. When authorities first interrogated Evans in London, they showed him the clothing from his wife and daughter and informed him where they had been found. When conducting this interrogation, police literally gave Evans enough knowledge about the case to accurately confess about the murders of his wife and daughter. Observers believed that Evans's confessions were a matter of the police inventing his culpability. On the other hand, Christie's statements were taken at face value and no further inquiry seemed necessary. The case seems to have been concluded until authorities turned their attention toward the convincing prosecution witness, Christie. and realized an innocent man may have been convicted for a crime that he did not commit. John Reginald Halliday Christie was born in Halifax, West Riding of Yorkshire, on April 8, 1899, and had a relatively uneventful childhood. As a young man, Christie enlisted and then served as an infantryman in World War I, joining the 52nd Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire Regiment. In 1918, Christie's regiment had been deployed to France, where he took the position as a signalman with the Duke of Wellington's West Riding Regiment. Christie suffered an injury from a mustard gas attack and spent a month in a hospital in Calais recuperating. Christie later claimed that as a result of the injury he sustained, he suffered blindness and became a mute for 3.5 years. Additionally, Christie maintained throughout his life that because of the gas injury, he could not speak above a whisper. Since then, there have been several criminologists that maintain that Christie's lack of audible discernment was a result of a psychological mechanism rather than any toxic effects of the gas. This was an apparent reach for sympathy rather than a legitimate wartime wound. Moreover, it appeared that Christie suffered for a lifetime with impotence. It seemed the only time he could have sex was with prostitutes, and he steadily gained a reputation with the nicknames of Reggie No Dick and Can't Do It Christie. Despite this lack of sexual proficiency, Christie married Ethel Simpson from Sheffield at Halifax Register Office. He remained impotent with his wife, but continued to have sex with prostitutes. After 4 years of marriage, Christie and Ethel separated, with him moving to London and Ethel staying with relatives in Sheffield. Following his marriage to Ethel and extending into the first 10 years of that marriage, Christie committed many crimes and served time in prison for those transgressions. While working as a postman, Christie stole packages and received a sentence after his trial on April 12, 1921, of 3 months. In January 1923, Christie was convicted of obtaining money under false pretenses and violent conduct, where he was held over and then sentenced to 12 months probation. He committed further crimes of larceny in 1924 and received 2 consecutive sentences of 3 and 6 months imprisonment from September 1924. Later in the decade, Christie's crimes became more violently defined when, in May 1929, he was convicted of assaulting a prostitute that he cohabitated with in Battersea and then sentenced to 6 months hard labor. It turned out that Christie attacked the woman with a cricket bat, in which the judge described as a murderous attack. In 1933, a court found Christie guilty of auto theft as he stole a vehicle from a trusting priest that befriended him. His sentence for that crime amounted to 3 months incarceration. After his release from prison in 1933, Christie and Ethel reconciled, and although he ceased his run of petty crimes, Christie continued to engage the services of prostitutes. In December 1938, Christie and Ethel moved to a ground-floor flat located at 10 Rillington Place at Ladbroke Grove, a rather run-down area of London. A 3-story brick terrace where the ground and first floors contained a bedroom, living room, and kitchen, but the second-floor flat had no living room. The building contained just one outside bathroom that the tenants had to share, as none of the apartments contained indoor plumbing. When World War II broke out, Christie applied and then appealed to become part of the War Reserve Police, since it became evident that the powers hiring for the force were desperate for applicants. They either ignored his criminal record or just did not verify that he had one. Christie walked a beat near the Harrow Road police station, where he met a woman and soon began an affair. The relationship lasted until 1943, when the woman's husband returned from duty in the war. He discovered Christie in his house and assaulted him brutally. In August of 1943, Christie met an Austrian munitions worker and part-time prostitute named Ruth First. First had been soliciting clients in a snack bar located at Ladbroke Grove. When the two went back to Christie's flat to have sex, at the height of his passion, Christie grabbed the woman by the throat and began strangling her. Eventually, First succumbed to Christie's grip. Panicking at the thought of murder, Christie buried First's body underneath the floorboards of his front living room, and then when the corpse began to emit an aroma, he buried her in the back garden at 10 Rillington Place. Subsequent to the Ruth First murder, Christie resigned as a special constable. The next year, he found employment as a clerk in a radio factory. He struck up a friendship with a fellow co-worker named Muriel Amelia Edie. In October 1944, he invited the young lady to his residence with promises that he had a special concoction that would cure her chronic bronchitis. While the young woman sat in Christie's flat, he gave her instructions to inhale from a tube connected to a jar that allegedly held a mixture. The mixture was Friar's balsam that Christie used to disguise the smell of domestic natural gas. Edie's back was turned toward Christie, and then he attached a second tube attached to the house's gas tap. Edie continued breathing, not knowing that she was inhaling pure natural gas. The gas Christie made her inhale was actually coal gas, which was pure carbon monoxide. Upon Edie losing consciousness, Christie sexually abused her and then strangled her to death. He buried her body right next to Ruth First in the back garden of the house. During Easter of 1948, Timothy and Beryl Evans moved into the top floor at 10 Rillington Place. Shortly thereafter, Beryl gave birth to a baby girl, Geraldine, in October 1948. Later, in 1949, Evans reported that his wife was dead. At first, Evans reported that his wife died as a result of a botched abortion performed by his neighbor, but then he confessed and was executed. 3 years after the murders of Beryl and Geraldine Evans, Christie lost his job at the Post Office Savings Bank due to his past criminal activities, but he found employment very quickly thereafter with the British Road Services at their Shepherd's Bush depot. At the concurrent time, new tenants moved into the building. Black immigrants from the West Indies took up residence at 10 Rillington Place, and this did not sit well with the Christies. The Christies regarded their new neighbors as inferior and despised them. Ethel went so far as to prosecute one of the neighbors for assault. Christie knew that if the neighbors started snooping around the garden, his crimes may be discovered. So, in a legal maneuver, Christie negotiated with an indigent defender attorney to continue to have exclusive use of the back garden, with the space separating him from the neighbors. His secrets remained secure, for the time being. On December 6, 1952, Christie resigned from his job. On the morning of December 14, 1952, Christie woke up and did not disturb Ethel. While she lay there peacefully sleeping, Christie gingerly placed his hands around her throat and strangled her to death. When neighbors and other residents in the area noticed Ethel missing, Christie responded to any queries about her disappearance with several stories. In a letter to relatives in Sheffield, Christie stated that his wife suffered from rheumatism and could not write the letter herself. To one neighbor, he stated that Ethel visited relatives in Sheffield, and to another, she was visiting Birmingham. Christie sold Ethel's wedding ring, his watch, and his furniture in order to support himself until he could, again, find gainful employment. He also had his unemployment to rely on, but he also went to the bank, forged Ethel's signature, and emptied her bank account on January 26, 1953. It seemed after Ethel's death that Christie began a short reign of murder that accelerated. Between January 19, 1953 and March 6, 1953, Christie murdered Kathleen Maloney, a prostitute from the Ladbroke Grove area, Rita Nelson, who was from Belfast, Northern Ireland, and visiting her sister in Ladbroke Grove when she met Christie and he murdered her, and Hectorina McClenna, who was living with her boyfriend in London. Christie invited all three of the women back to his residence, but with McClenna, he allowed her and her boyfriend to stay at 10 Rillington Place while they were looking for a residence. On one occasion, Christie found McClenna alone and invited her back to his residence. He strangled her there, and when Baker came looking for her, Christie informed the boyfriend that he had not seen her. Occasionally, Christie would meet with the young man to feign interest at the fate of the girl, even though he knew McClenna was dead. These three women, unfortunately, were Christie's last three victims.
At this time, he slightly adjusted his method that he had first utilized with Ruth Edie. His improved method consisted of just a small bulldog clip on a hose that was connected to the gas line. He seated the victims in the kitchen, released the clip on the tube, and released the gas into the room. Later, authorities determined that this method was obsolete, and Christie would have suffered from the gas as well. The investigators truly believed that the last 3 victims succumbed to carbon monoxide poisoning. The authorities also learned that Christie raped his victims while they were unconscious. After murdering the 3 women, Christie hid the bodies behind a small alcove behind the kitchen wall, which he then covered with wallpaper. He wrapped the victims in blankets, then placed them in the alcove. On March 20th, 1953, Christie moved out of 10 Rillington Place, and he illegally sublet the apartment. When the landlord for the building visited the residence, he became incensed that Christie was nowhere to be found and ordered the tenants to leave the next morning. The tenant on the top floor, Beresford Brown, requested that he be allowed to use Christie's kitchen, a request which the landlord granted. On March 23rd, Brown attempted to install a shelf for a wireless set and discovered the alcove. When Brown pulled back the wallpaper covering the alcove, he discovered the bodies of Maloney, Nelson, and McLennan. Once Brown alerted another neighbor, and they confirmed that they were indeed dead bodies, he summoned the police. Once the police arrived and made some inquiries, a citywide search commenced looking for Christie. Subsequent to his leaving Rillington Place, Christie checked into Rowton House in King's Cross, where he booked a room for 7 nights under his real name and address. Christie only spent 4 nights there, leaving the residence when news of the body's discoveries hit the newsstands. He just wandered around London, spending most of his time in cafes. On the morning of March 31st, 1953, a police officer challenged Christie when he ran across him on the embankment near Putney Bridge. When asked to empty his pockets, the only thing Christie produced were some coins and an old newspaper clipping regarding the remand of Timothy Evans. The officer took the pathetic man into the police station. Authorities believe that Christie may have been a tough nut to crack, but while in custody, he confessed to the murder of 7 women. Christie also confessed to the murder of Beryl Evans. The court determined that they would only charge Christie with the murder of Ethel Christie, even though his confession proved authentic. Christie was brought before the Crown on June 22, 1953, in the same courtroom in which he testified against Timothy Evans. At first, Christie pled not guilty by reason of insanity and claimed that he had no memory of the events at all. The jury rejected the plea, and after a very short trial, the jury only deliberated for approximately 85 minutes and then found Christie guilty. The convicted man refused to appeal his conviction, and on July 15, 1953, Christie stood on the gallows. Prior to the executioner pulling the lever to release the trapdoors, Christie stated that his nose itched. The executioner responded that it wouldn't bother him for much longer. The tiny village of Alton, East Hampshire, had been known for its production of beer due to the large hops fields located near the town. The hamlet manufactured paper during the Middle Ages and also served as a picturesque market and was the site of a famous English Civil War battle in the 17th century. In 1863, the first brewery opened near the town due to the overabundance of hops, the main ingredient of beer, and demonstrated a great place to inhabit, start a business, and more importantly, start a family. Crime had never been a problem with the constabulary there. Of course, there were the occasional drunken disorderlies, but Alton was known for its small commercial contributions and the safety that families enjoyed throughout the centuries. On August 27, 1867, 7-year-old Fanny Adams and her closest friend, Minnie Warner, along with Fanny's 7-year-old sister, Lizzie, traveled down a country lane near the small village of Alton. While in the small clearing, the girls noticed a young man, well-dressed, but stumbling slightly as he appeared to have been drinking. The young man approached the girls and offered Minnie a halfpence so that she and Lizzie would go to the village and spend it the way they wanted. The young man offered the money to the young girls so that he could be alone with Fanny. Fanny accompanied the young man to the hollow, an area familiar to children near the village. As Minnie and Lizzie walked away, the young man picked Fanny up and walked toward a local hops field, out of sight from the other children. This occurred at approximately 1 p.m. At approximately 5 p.m., Minnie and Lizzie, who had been playing since they met the young man, left for their journey home. A neighbor of the young girls, a Mrs. Gardner, saw the girls returning home, but she didn't see Fanny, as she knew that Lizzie and Fanny always played together. Mrs. Gardner rushed to tell Mrs. Harriet Adams, Fanny and Lizzie's mother, that Fanny appeared missing. Just as Mrs. Gardner informed Mrs. Harriet Adams, they noticed a young man walking from the hop field. Mrs. Gardner approached the man and demanded to know what he had done with Fanny. The young man responded that he didn't do anything. He merely gave the girls money for candy. It's what he has always done with young children around the town. When queried again, the young man stated that Fanny left him in the hop field to rejoin his friends. Because he dressed rather respectfully and carried himself in a dignified manner. Actually, he informed the women that he worked for a local solicitor, William Clement. The two ladies thought nothing of it and allowed him to go about his way. At approximately 7 p.m. that evening, Fanny had not returned, and the adults of the village decided to organize a search party. The group walked with a purpose to the first place mentioned where Fanny was last seen. It did not take long for the members of the search party to locate her, but nothing prepared the party for the condition in which they did locate the young girl. As noted by one observer, it was a sickening scene of carnage. The child's severed head lay on 2 poles, deeply slashed from mouth to ear and across the left temple. Most horribly, both eyes were missing. Nearby lay a leg and a thigh. When the party spread out over the hop field, they located other parts of the murdered little girl. In one area, the searchers found the entire contents of Fanny's chest and pelvis, with the contents being scattered all over the place. Her internal organs were found a short distance away from this major discovery, slashed and mutilated. It took several days before the little girl's remains could be reassembled. Her eyes were later found in the River Wey. The obvious question that villagers asked was how could someone be so savage and callous as to not only murder a beautiful young child, but butcher and dismember her body in such a barbarous manner. Mrs. Adams collapsed as a result of learning the news about her daughter. She then had to inform George Adams, a bricklayer, about his daughter's fate. It appeared that he was playing cricket on the Butts, just south of the town. Mr. Adams collapsed as well from exhaustion and grief. When he regained his composure, George Adams, enraged and grief-stricken, returned to the family's home and retrieved his shotgun. Adams then went to the hop field to search for the murderer. Neighbors caught up with the distraught father and disarmed him, saying, "Let the law do their job." Police Superintendent William Cheney started an investigation into the case and then decided that the murderer may have been hiding in plain sight the whole time. He went to visit the obvious suspect, the young man that Mrs. Adams and Mrs. Gardner confronted coming from the hop field. Superintendent Cheney noted that the young man worked as a clerk for the local solicitor and found him there, working late. The young man, Frederick Baker, denied any knowledge of the disappearance and murder of little Fanny Adams. Superintendent Cheney arrested Baker and walked him out the door of the solicitor's office. When the lawman and his suspect walked out of the front door, a large crowd had gathered and surrounded the hunter and his quarry. Fortunately, Cheney escorted Baker to the Alton police station without incident. Superintendent Cheney noted that upon further examination of Baker's clothing, it appeared that droplets of blood were smeared onto the wristband of his shirt, and his boots, socks, and trousers appeared wet. When police noted the condition of his clothing, Baker stated, "That won't hang me, will it?" Baker stated that he often stepped in water as he walked outside, but had no explanation as to the blood drops on his wristbands. The police found more evidence when they searched the suspect and discovered 2 small knives, one of them stained with blood. Superintendent Cheney then locked the suspect up in the jail and went to investigate Baker's whereabouts on the day of the murder. On the afternoon of the murder, witnesses confirmed that Baker left the solicitor's office sometime around 1 p.m. on August 24th and returned to the office sometime around 3:25 p.m. Baker left the office again at 5:30 p.m. Mrs. Gardner and Mrs. Harriet Adams saw Baker coming from the direction of the hop field sometime around 5 p.m. Authorities theorized that Baker murdered little Fanny Adams upon first leaving the office, and then the second sojourn, he dismembered the body. One of the other clerks in the office where Baker worked, Maurice Biddle, stated that he saw the suspect at their place of employment at approximately 6 p.m., where Baker related to his co-worker the confrontation with Mrs. Gardner and Mrs. Adams, and Baker appeared unsettled. Biddle related that Baker stated, "It will be very awkward for me if the child is murdered." Biddle also related that he and Baker went to a pub and had a pint or 2, and Baker told Biddle he may have to leave town the following Monday. Biddle informed Baker that if he did that, he may have problems finding a job. Baker then stated, "I could go as a butcher." On the following Monday after Baker's detention, Biddle went searching through Baker's work desk and found a journal that contained an entry that Baker admitted to writing after his arrest. The entry stated, 24th August, Saturday, killed a young girl. It was fine and hot. Baker would later aver that he wrote the entry when he was drunk and that it only meant that he was aware a young girl had been murdered. A young boy came forward to give a statement regarding the day of Fanny's murder. The young man stated that he witnessed Baker emerging from the hop garden at 2 p.m. His hands were bloody, as was his clothing. While Baker sat in jail, a local painter, William Walker, had found a large stone on the hop field with blood, long hair, and a small piece of flesh stuck to it. This discovery caused the local division surgeon, Dr. Lewis Leslie, to declare that the stone was most probably the murder weapon. At the inquest conducted before the deputy county coroner, Robert Harfield, at the Duke's Inn, a local jury had been assembled. Considering the evidence thus far, including Minnie Warner, who described what occurred that day, they believed that Baker murdered and then dismembered Fanny Adams and returned a verdict of willful murder for killing and slaying Fanny Adams. Authorities then remanded the defendant to the Winchester prison for a formal committal hearing, committing the defendant to trial. On August 29, 1867, a committal hearing was held at the Alton Town Hall before the local magistrates. Frederick Baker, still protesting his innocence, was remanded back to the prison where he would be held for trial at the next county assizes. Baker implored the authorities for more protection as he feared a large mob would kidnap him from the local jail and lynch him. The trial opened on December 5, 1867, with the courtroom waiting for the little Minnie Warner, who had to be carried into the courtroom to testify. Immediately upon the child identifying Baker as the man that offered the girls money and carried Fanny into the hop field, the defense strenuously objected and concentrated on Baker's mental health, which, subsequently, the court and the public discovered a long history of hereditary insanity. The defense brought to the surface how Baker's father had a propensity to murder his own children, although no evidence came to the forefront proving this assertion. A cousin who had been in and out of asylums for most of his life, and Baker attempting suicide after a failed love affair. At the conclusion of the succinct trial, after all evidence and testimony had been presented to the jury, the judge gave his charges and then released them for deliberation. 15 minutes after the judge issued his charges, the jury announced they had a verdict. The jury stated that they found the defendant guilty of the crime charged and fixed the penalty at death by hanging. On Christmas morning, December 25, 1867, in front of a crowd that numbered more than 5,000, considerably more than the population of Alton, Hampshire, Frederick Baker climbed the gallows, and within 10 minutes, the court sentence had been carried out. After his execution, the public discovered that Baker had written a letter to Fanny's parents where he expressed, in an unguarded hour and not with malice aforethought, he murdered Fanny Adams. Baker assured the parents that her death was without any pain or struggle. Baker steadfastly denied any other violations of the child, with the dismemberment as an exception. Fanny's headstone had been erected soon after her death, but it was only renovated a few decades ago and still stands where it was originally erected. Here, in this photograph, we see the headstone flanked by Minnie Weaver and Fanny's little sister, Lizzie Adams, the two girls who accompanied her the day of Fanny's death and identified Frederick Baker as the culprit. (1913) Atlanta. The city grew steadily since the end of Reconstruction, when the city fathers decided to rely on manufacturing instead of the centuries-old staple of agriculture. With the declining price of cotton, a growing economy, and the need to fill jobs, many people left country living for the life in the big city. In turn, housing in the major metropolitan area barely accommodated those who lived in primitive conditions. A thriving metropolis that was just 40 years removed from the Civil War, beneath the surface of the city's conscience, Atlanta still held on to the racial animus that prevailed in the Reconstruction South. Although the citizenry held close to firmly held beliefs of white supremacy, the Jewish population of the state of Georgia felt no fear, as prejudice toward blacks was tantamount to any other race. The only dislike that whites held toward Jews in Atlanta stemmed from the ownership of businesses where they employed children. Child labor laws had not yet passed nationally, but the utilization of children in manual labor stayed on the minds of parents and those advocates of children who worked to give their greatest resource back, their childhood. It was in this atmosphere that the rule of law would be tested and the conscience of a nation bled with sympathy and hatred at the same time. At approximately 3 a.m., on the morning of April 27, 1913, the night watchman for the National Pencil Factory, Newt Lee, ventured down to the basement of the factory to use the bathroom. After leaving the bathroom, Lee walked to the back of the basement and discovered the body of a young girl near the incinerator. Lee noticed that the young girl's dress had been rolled up around her waist and a piece of her petticoat torn off and left around her neck, apparently used to strangle the girl. Lee also noticed that the girl's face was blackened and scratched up, her head battered and bruised. A 7-foot strip of 1/4-inch wrapping cord had been tied in a loop around her neck and buried very deeply into her flesh. Her underwear had been torn and stained with blood. Lee noticed that the poor girl's skin was covered with ash and dirt, signifying that the victim did not go easily. After discovering the body, Newt Lee first called the factory manager but received no answer, then called the police. When the police arrived, they noticed a service ramp at the rear of the basement led to a sliding door that opened into a back alley. This door appeared to have been jimmied to make entry easier. Police noticed a narrow trail of dirt leading from the elevator to where the little girl had been found, denoting that the body had been dragged there. The police also located bloody fingerprints on the door leading from the street into the basement. 2 notes were left at the crime scene and appeared to have been written by an uneducated hand.
He said he would love me laying down, play like the night witch did it, but that long, tall black Negro did, boy, his slept.
The other letter said,
Ma'am, that Negro hired down here did this. I went to make water and he pushed me down that hole. A long, tall Negro black, that who it was, long, slim, tall Negro I write while play with me.
When the police read the notes out loud, Newt Lee exclaimed, quote, "Boss, it looks like they're trying to lay it on me," end quote. As a result of the notes, police arrested Newt Lee. Since he reported the discovery of the body, then he must have committed the murder, which today the arrest would be considered highly suspect. And a gentleman named Arthur Molyneux, who was seen with a young girl late Saturday night before her body had been discovered. The little girl was identified as Mary Fagan, 13 years old, and an employee of the factory that the manager laid off the previous week. Eventually, police arrested 2 others they suspected of being responsible for the murder of little Mary Fagan: John M. Gant, a former bookkeeper for the pencil factory, and Gordon Bailey, the young black elevator operator. When police later searched the 2nd floor of the pencil factory near the manager's office, they discovered hair and blood near a lathe and became convinced that the murder took place on the 2nd floor and Fagan's body had been dragged to the basement. Subsequent to this discovery, the hair was proven not to be Fagan's and the blood was identified as paint. Prosecutor Hugh Dorsey chose to ignore this for the trial later. Newt Lee reiterated to police that he attempted to telephone the factory's manager, Leo Max Frank, but received no answer. Later, the police went to Frank's residence at approximately 7 a.m. that morning and requested that he accompany them back to the factory without notifying Frank of the incident that occurred. Frank acted quite agitated when confronted by the police, exhibiting nervousness, and he appeared to be very pale. Detectives brought Frank to his office to check his ledger book to identify whether Fagan worked at the factory or not. Frank stated that he did not know the girl, but that all of the employees were identified by an employee number which he kept in a ledger book for the payroll. Detectives then escorted Frank on the elevator to the basement. When the elevator reached the bottom, and when the detectives and Frank got off the elevator, a horrendous smell permeated the area. Police later discovered that someone defecated in the elevator shaft, and when the elevator came to rest, it smashed the feces, creating the smell. This became an essential factor later in the case. Detectives then took Frank to the morgue to view the body of the girl, and Frank reiterated that he did not recognize her. Police returned Frank to his home at approximately 10:45 a.m. that morning, and, at the time, did not consider him a suspect. On Monday, April 28, 1913, Frank, accompanied by an attorney, Luther Rosser, went to the Atlanta police station and gave a written deposition where he provided a timeline of his activities on the Saturday before Lee discovered Fagan's body. Frank stated that Fagan entered his office between 12:05 and 12:15 p.m. on that Saturday, April 26th. According to the witness, Lee arrived at 4 p.m. and Frank asked him to return as the manager did not want to be disturbed by the noisy cleaning that Lee was assigned to do. Lee was to punch into the time clock every half hour, but police noticed there were several gaps in Lee's time card. At the insistence of his lawyer, Rosser, Frank exposed his body to demonstrate he had no scratches on his body as if he were involved in a struggle, nor did his suit have the appearance of any blood. Frank wore the same suit to the deposition as he had on the day the murder allegedly took place. In a subsequent search of Frank's laundry at his residence, they found no blood there either. After giving his deposition, Frank then met with the Pinkerton detectives hired by the owners of the pencil factory to assist the police with their investigation. The detectives did investigate many leads, even the ones that may have hurt Frank. Several rumors circulated that Frank took liberties with the young female employees at the factory. The detectives investigated those as well, but found no substantiation in any of them. One of the Pinkerton detectives, Harry Scott, was to work close with one of the Atlanta police investigators, John Black. But from the minute that Black questioned Frank, he believed the factory manager to be guilty and therefore presented a conflict of interest. On April 29, 1913, Police arrived at Frank's residence to conduct a search. Investigators found a white shirt smeared with blood up on the armpits, and the shirt appeared to have been unused. Police believed this to be a plant in Frank's residence and ridiculously believed that Frank himself had planted the shirt. On the day of the search, at 11:30 a.m., police went to the American Pencil Factory and arrested Leo Max Frank for the murder of Mary Fagan. At the time of Frank's arrest, most Jewish citizens in the city believed that the police were looking for a scapegoat to the murder. Frank was born in New York City in 1884 and later attended Cornell University, where he received a degree in mechanical engineering. His uncle, Moses Frank, was part owner in the pencil factory in Atlanta and felt confident that Leo had the industriousness and intelligence to run the factory efficiently. When Frank moved to Atlanta in 1910, he met and fell in love with Lucille Selig, a young woman from a prominent Jewish family, and the two soon were married. Hardworking and resourceful, Leo Frank turned the American Pencil Factory into a very profitable business. Nothing in his background denoted the type of fiendish proclivities he would later be accused of by the state of Georgia. On April 30th, 1913, authorities held an inquest into the death of Mary Fagan. Frank testified at the inquest and recounted, again, the events of Saturday, April 26th. Several other witnesses came forward at the inquest and testified that Mary Fagan often complained about Frank and the way he looked at the other young females who worked at the factory, with one witness stating that factory manager flirted with some women and even propositioned another. Even with these attestations, the detectives admitted, quote, "They so far have obtained no conclusive evidence or clues in the baffling mystery," end quote. But the mystery became more complicated as the investigation continued. William J. Burns of the Burns Detective Agency traveled to Atlanta to assist in the investigation, having been engaged by the owners of the pencil factory. Later in the month of May, Burns withdrew, and one of his detectives assigned to the case stated, quote, "We came down to investigate a murder, not engage in petty politics," end quote. Even though the inquest produced no conclusive evidence that Frank murdered Fagan, the police laid their hopes for convicting Frank on the word of a manipulative, conniving, decadent brute named Jim Conley. Conley first came to the notice of the Atlanta authorities in the Fagan case when, on May 1st, 1913, someone observed him washing some red stains from a shirt in a basin at the factory. Police brought Conley into custody and later learned that the stains were rust and returned the shirt to Conley. Furthermore, someone police questioned earlier stated they witnessed a black man in dark blue clothing and a hat loitering in the lobby of the factory on the day of the murder. Investigators doubted the story Conley told and held him for an additional 2 weeks for further questioning. Finally, Conley related his version of what happened. Police then released Arthur Molyneux and John Gant on May 1st, 1913. Conley admitted he wrote the notes discovered at the crime scene, stating that Frank dictated what Conley wrote. Investigators tested Conley's handwriting between the suspect writing, quote, "night watchman," end quote, and, quote, "night witch," end quote. Although convinced that Conley wrote the notes, investigators expressly doubted the rest of the story that Frank premeditated the murder and involved Conley as an accomplice. Upon questioning, Conley stated that on the day of the murder, he visited some bar rooms and shot dice and drank. At first, Conley claimed that he could neither read nor write, which police later proved false as they produced promissory notes that he signed borrowing money from another individual. Conley wrote several statements, and on the third try, he stated he lied about the Friday meeting with Frank and instead stated it was on Saturday that he met the factory manager on the street on Saturday, April 26th. Conley related that when he met Frank outside of the factory, Frank directed the suspect to follow him into the factory. Frank then told Conley to hide in a wardrobe closet because 2 women were coming to visit him and the manager did not want Conley exposed. Conley emphasized that Frank dictated the notes to him, gave him some cigarettes, and then instructed him to leave the factory. Conley swore he did not hear about the murder until the next day. Conley then went drinking and then to a movie.
Pencil company officials exclaimed that Connolly's story was false. How did Connolly believe that a crime had not been committed when asked to write notes about it? Newspapers in Atlanta received premier coverage and ran the stories that Frank was all but guilty of the murder. Subsequently, police tried to arrange a meeting between Frank and Connolly, but Frank refused to attend without his lawyer, who happened to be out of town at the time. Police deduced, rather wrongly, that Frank's refusal to meeting Connolly face-to-face signified Frank's guilt. On May 5, 1913, Coroner H.F. Harris finally conducted the autopsy on Mary Fagan's corpse.
On removing the skull, I found there was no actual break of the skull, but a little hemorrhage under the skull. I think beyond any question she came to her death from strangulation from this cord being wound around her neck. I made an examination of the privates of Mary Fagan. I found no spermatozoa. On the walls of the vagina there was evidence of violence of some kind. The epithelium was pulled loose, completely detached in places. Blood vessels were dilated immediately beneath the surface, and a great deal of hemorrhage in the surrounding tissues. The dilation of the blood vessels indicated to me that the injury had been made to the vagina some little time before death, perhaps 10 to 15 minutes. The fact that the child was strangled to death was indicated by the lividity, the blueness of the parts, the congestion of the tongue and mouth, and the blueness of the hands and fingernails. Dr. H.F. Harris, May 1913.
Also on May 5th, Frank produced an alibi character witness named Lemmy Quinn, the foreman in Fagan's area of the factory. Quinn stated that he saw Frank the Saturday of the murder a few minutes after 12:20 p.m. Quinn also stated that he knew Frank very well. He swore he was not guilty of the murder. Several additional witnesses came forward to state that they saw a young female resembling Fagan, and it appeared that she had been drugged. Detectives accused Frank of bribing the witnesses to make those statements, and the police discounted them. On May 9, 1913, 14-year-old Maureen Stover, an employee at the factory, stated she went to the factory that Saturday and noticed Frank not in his office at the time he related to the police. Another woman came forward and stated as she walked past the factory at approximately 4:30 p.m. on Saturday afternoon, she heard 3 piercing screams emanating from the building. On May 10, 1913, an ex-police officer named Robert House claimed that he once caught Frank in the woods with an underage girl engaged in, quote, immoral acts, end quote. House added that Frank begged the ex-policeman not to report the incident. House's statement could not be corroborated. Armed with the testimony of Jim Connolly and the investigators considering Frank's behavior suspicious, on May 24, 1913, a grand jury formally indicted Leo Max Frank for the murder of Mary Fagan. Solicitor Dorsey strongly recommended to the grand jury not to indict Connolly. Every time press coverage increased, Connolly rose to the occasion and embellished his story further. On May 29th, in another 4-hour interrogation, Connolly averred that Frank said to him, quote, he had picked up a girl back there and let her fall and that her head hit up against something, end quote. Connolly continued that he assisted Frank in taking the girl's body to the basement via the elevator, and then when they returned to Frank's office, began to compose the murder notes. Connolly further related that Frank gave him $200, but later demanded it back and said he would make it up to him on Monday, quoting Frank as saying, quote, if I live and nothing happens, end quote. On June 5, 1913, the Columbus Daily Inquirer-Sun reported that a black woman named Mineola McKnight, a former housekeeper of the Franks, had been arrested and gave a statement where she alleged that on the night of the homicide, Frank had been drinking and looked for a pistol with which to kill himself. No matter who came forward with the story, State Solicitor Hugh Dorsey believed he had enough evidence to convict Frank of Fagan's murder. A rooming house proprietor by the name of Miss Min Fonby gave a statement to the police that a man matching Leo Frank's description tried to rent a room for he and a young girl on the night of the murder. Examining these informants, who came forward so late in the investigation, one must seriously question their believability, no matter how many of them came forward. Dorsey crusaded further with the trial of the people of the state of Georgia versus Leo M. Frank. The trial began after a series of continuances on July 28, 1913. The first witness called to testify was Newt Lee, the man who discovered Fagan's body and whom police believed initially committed the murder. His story rarely changed to where the defense would question his sincerity and adherence to the truth. Mrs. J.W. Coleman was called to the witness stand, Mary Fagan's mother, to identify the clothing found on her daughter's body when Lee discovered her in the basement. Luther Rosser and Reuben Arnold, only two of the attorneys from Frank's 8-member defense team, sought to connect Lee with the murders. Upon cross-examination by the defense, Rosser made the argument that the police may have instructed Lee on what the alleged murderer wrote in the murder notes found beside the body of Mary Fagan. Solicitor Dorsey stated at that point in the proceedings that the notes had not been entered into evidence yet, and therefore Rosser did not lay the proper evidentiary foundation to question the witness about them. Rosser then declared,
"We've got to commence somewhere and at home sometime to show the Negro is a criminal, and we might as well begin here as anywhere else."
Luther Rosser.
Both of the legal teams seriously considered whether the word of a black witness against a white defendant may cause more trouble in the white South. After the exchange of barbs between the prosecution and the defense, the trial continued with no further effort on the defense's part to connect Lee to the murder. The bulk of the prosecution's plan was to focus on Frank's alleged sexual behavior with the female workers in the factory. The prosecution alleged that Frank, with Conley's assistance, often met women in his office to engage in sex. On the day of the murder, Conley testified that he saw a girl matching the description of Mary Fagan enter Frank's office in the afternoon, and shortly thereafter heard a loud scream. A short time after that, Frank called Conley to his office and showed him Fagan's body, claiming that he hurt her, but he didn't mean to. Conley repeated a lot of what he put into his affidavits, that he and Frank took Fagan's body to the basement in the elevator, then returned to the elevator and sat in Frank's office where Frank allegedly dictated the murder notes to him. Defense attorneys cross-examined Conley for 16 hours over the course of 3 days, but could not shake his story. The defense also called a series of witnesses that testified they had never seen Frank flirt with the female workers at the factory and considered him to be a man of, quote, good character, end quote. By the end of the trial, in fact, over 24 witnesses testified that Frank acted as a gentleman around females at the factory. On August 18, 1913, Leo Frank finally took the stand in his own defense. Frank, at first, explained the operation of the business in his charge. He explained ledger books and appeared to be more bookish than a lustful male animal as the prosecution attempted to portray him to the jury. Frank gave the details of his movements on the day of the murder and steadfastly denied that he murdered Mary Fagan. Of course, Solicitor Dorsey brought forth witnesses that allegedly discounted Frank's version of events. On August 20, 1913, final arguments began in the People v. Leo Frank. Near the end of the closing argument by the prosecution, as if from a Hollywood script, Dorsey could not have timed his speech any better, as he instructed the jury to find the defendant guilty, 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 by the ringing of the 12 o'clock bells of a nearby Catholic church. The gallery and other spectators heard the dramatic soliloquy as Dorsey repeated the word 12 times to supreme dramatic effect. After almost 4 days of a closing argument, Solicitor Dorsey completed his statement. The case went to the jury in the afternoon of August 25th. The jury left the courtroom after receiving their instructions from Judge Leonard Roan at 1:40 p.m. Then reported around 4:37 p.m. they reached a verdict. Through a unanimous decision, the jury found Leo Max Frank guilty of the murder of Mary Fagan. Frank showed no emotion as the judge read the verdict. Immediately, Jewish groups across the nation protested that the reason for Frank's conviction stemmed from a virulent anti-Semitism plaguing the South. Efforts of Jewish groups all over the nation continued for a long time, but had no influence on the people, newspapers, or the judicial system. Immediately after the verdict, defense counsel Rosser filed a motion for a new trial. In the motion, Rosser cited mistakes made in procedural error as well as prejudice, stating that members of that body were intimidated by crowds outside of the courtroom at the time of the trial. Judge Rohn denied the motion for new trial and stated to the opposing counsels,
I have thought about this case more than any other I have tried. With all the thought I have put on this case, I am not thoroughly convinced that Frank is guilty or innocent. But I do not have to be convinced. The jury was convinced. There is no room to doubt that. Judge Leonard S. Rohn, 1913.
The murder of Mary Fagan, the investigation, and the trial, to outside observers, seemed to be conducted with the utmost of unprofessionalism, both in the character of the police and the media at the time. Until recently, before the murder, Atlanta did not have that many newspapers to report the news. But when William Randolph Hearst purchased the Georgian, he brought some of the star reporters from New York to staff the paper. It should be noted that Frank was judged guilty in the press before going to trial because of jingoism and, quote, yellow journalism, end quote, displayed by Hearst's reporters. One only has to remember that 15 years before, Hearst and Charles Pulitzer competed against each other for circulation in New York. In doing so, both publishers enhanced their publishing credentials with providing the public with entertainment rather than solid journalism. It is for this reason that the United States eventually declared war on Spain and engaged in a 7-month-long conflict, all due to faulty reporting and the sense that the U.S. should engage in globalism. Hearst brought that same attitude in journalism to Atlanta. Additionally, as a result of the newspaper reporting, anti-Semitism grew rampant. This is not to say that it did not already exist in the South, especially Georgia at the time, but until the arrest of Leo Frank and the accusation that he committed murder, Jews in Atlanta got along with their Gentile neighbors like family. After the Frank verdict, that sentiment saw itself thrown to the wayside and old prejudices surfaced. Tom Watson, a local politician and failed presidential candidate, fueled further hatred against Jews and influenced the public into believing that Frank truly was guilty of the murder of Mary Fagan. At every turn, the state shot down every issue the defense raised at this appeal. The Georgia Supreme Court rejected the appeal after hearing the arguments and on taking them up for consideration on November 14, 1914. Defense counsel Rosser and Arnold next sought to bring the case to the federal level. The case finally reached the U.S. Supreme Court. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes gave an opinion where he seriously doubted if the petitioner had due process of law. Quote, because the trial taking place in the presence of a hostile demonstration and seemingly dangerous crowd, thought by the presiding judge to be ready for violence unless a verdict of guilty was rendered, end quote. On April 19, 1915, the U.S. Supreme Court denied the appeal by a vote of 7-2. The dissenting justices encouraged the defense team to file a motion of habeas corpus stating that Frank had been denied due process because of the threat of crowd violence if Frank were judged innocent. 3 days after the Supreme Court denial, Frank's defense team filed a commutation of sentence to the 3-person prison commission in Georgia. In a vote of 2-1, Frank's appeal for a commutation was rejected. The one dissension mentioned that he thought it was wrong and unjust to execute a man on the testimony of an accomplice, and that the, quote, circumstances of the crime tend to fix the guilt upon the accomplice, end quote. The application for commutation of sentence then went to Governor John Slayton. The people of Georgia elected Slayton in 1912, and his term would end just 4 days after Frank's scheduled execution. Before the murder of Mary Fagan, Slayton agreed to merge his law firm with that of Luther Rosser, Frank's defense attorney, and the prosecution contended that this presented a conflict of interest. Governor Slayton took Frank's appeal and opened hearings of the case to reevaluate it. Tom Watson denigrated Slayton for rehearing a case that had already made its way through the court system. Slayton examined over 10,000 documents, visited the crime scene, and examined new evidence presented. Governor Slayton suffered death threats and even a warning from the former governor of the state, Joseph Brown, who exclaimed to Slayton that if he wanted to bring back lynch law and destroy trial by jury, retry the Frank case. Watson sent a, quote, messenger, end quote, to Slayton that if he allowed Frank to hang, he could count on a, quote, friend, end quote, and holding office as a United States Senator could be in Slayton's future. Slayton reviewed the evidence and wrote a 29-page report. The governor criticized the press, especially those papers in the North, and other, quote, outsiders, end quote, and concentrated on the, quote, inconsistencies, end quote, in Conley's testimony and statements. According to the report, Governor Slayton stated two factors stood out: the transporting of the body to the basement and the murder notes found next to the murdered girl's body. When Conley was initially examined, investigators observed the feces at the bottom of the elevator shaft, which Conley stated he left there before the murder. Police and other investigators used the ladder to make their way to the crime scene, and not the elevator. The first time the elevator was used again was the Monday after the murder, when Frank and the detectives visited the crime scene and crushed the excrement. This detail demonstrated to Governor Slayton that Conley's rendition of using the elevator was incorrect and somewhat perjurious, and therefore cast doubt of Conley's recollections of the events of the day of the murder. William Banning Smith, Conley's attorney, had questions about the murder notes and did an analysis. Smith and his wife, a former English teacher, analyzed Conley's writings with an emphasis on speech patterns, writing patterns, spelling, grammar, repetition of adjectives, and favorite verb forms. It appeared, according to Smith, that Frank did not coerce Conley to write the notes, but that Conley wrote them of his own volition. Smith produced a 100-page report for the defense to use at the appeal before Governor Slayton. Furthermore, an affidavit from a former employee who left the company in 1912 stated that the notepads were sent to the basement to be burned, but no one ever got around to the task. The notes were not written in Frank's office, but in the basement. Governor Slayton's analysis of the evidence demonstrated that reasonable doubt existed as to Frank's guilt. Slayton also reviewed the wounds on the victim. He reasoned that Fagan's head wound certainly bled profusely, but no blood was found on the elevator or near the lathe nearby on the ground. Fagan's nostrils and mouth were filled with dirt that could have only come from the basement. Governor Slayton also stated that Conley's story of being a watchman for the factory manager during the alleged rendezvous with some of the factory females was suspect. Under Conley's story, Mary Fagan's virginal reputation would be at stake, and Governor Slayton stated that this would not be entertained. On June 21, 1915, Governor Slayton released an order commuting Frank's sentence to life imprisonment. The governor made it known that new evidence surfaced not available at the time of the trial, and Governor Slayton gave a press release that implored the people of Georgia to use restraint.
All I ask is that the people of Georgia read my statement and consider calmly the reasons I have given for commuting Leo Frank's sentence. Feeling as I do about the case, I would be a murderer if I allowed that man to hang. I would rather be plowing in a field than to feel for the rest of my life that I have that man's blood on my hands. Governor John Slayton, 1915.
Before announcing the commutation, Governor Slayton, realizing that his sentence would bring outrage amongst those citizens convinced of Frank's guilt, ordered that Frank be transferred from the Atlanta jail to the Milledgeville State Penitentiary in the middle of the night so that angered crowds would not seek extra-legal justice in a major metropolitan city. When Frank arrived at Milledgeville, another inmate, William Crean, tried to slash Frank's throat with a 7-inch butcher knife, severing his jugular vein. Crean later stated to law enforcement that, quote, Frank's presence was a disgrace to the prison, end quote, and, quote, he wanted to keep the inmates safe from any mob violence that may occur as a result of Frank being in Milledgeville, end quote. Crean also hoped that he would receive a pardon for the crimes that he committed if he murdered Frank. Governor Slayton and his wife received death threats, and the National Guard had to be summoned in order to preserve some semblance of order after the commutation announcement. Some residents of the state even burned the governor in effigy. Soon after the death of Mary Fagan, an organization formed in Marietta, Georgia, Mary Fagan's birthplace, much along the lines of the Ku Klux Klan. Quote,
the Knights of Mary Fagan, end quote. This group contained various members of Marietta hierarchy, including judges, former police chiefs, and former sheriffs. These, quote, Knights, end quote, as they were calling themselves, soon gathered in Marietta, Georgia, to plan a most diabolical act. In the afternoon of August 16, 1915, 8 automobiles left Marietta, Georgia, and made their way to Milledgeville State Penitentiary. The trip took them almost 7 hours, moving at a speed of almost 18 miles per hour. They arrived well after dark within the city limits and then made their way to the penitentiary. Without causing a stir or injuring any of the guards, the, quote, Knights, end quote, made their way into the prison and kidnapped Leo Frank. The group of 8 cars lumbered their way back to Marietta, and on the way, Frank took his wedding ring off his finger and handed it to the man guarding him. Frank then asked the man to make sure his wife would receive it. Without saying a word, the man acknowledged to Frank that his wish would be granted. Once the convoy arrived in a little oak grove outside of Marietta, Georgia, across the street from where Mary Fagan was born, at approximately 7 a.m., the men escorted Frank from the car, tied his legs and ankles together, and placed him upon a small table. Rumor had it that one of the executioners informed Frank that they were only carrying out the sentence of the court. One of the executioners placed a blindfold over Frank's eyes, then climbed down from the table. A noose was placed around Frank's neck. Then that executioner climbed down from the table. All at once, one of the men standing behind the table kicked it from under Frank. In a few minutes, Frank's dead body dangled from the tree branch. The ring arrived at Mrs. Frank's residence 2 days later. As Frank's body hung in the tree outside of Marietta, Georgia, throngs of men, women, and children gathered around the body. Some came to the location to gather souvenirs of the murder and this place in history. Some of the observers of the day wanted the body cut into pieces and burned. The individual that advocated this horrendous action, Robert E. Lee Howell, then tried to agitate the crowd into performing his wishes. A local judge, Newt Morris, reestablished order and ordered Frank's body cut down. When the body fell to the ground, Howell stamped Frank's face and chest. Morris had the man restrained and had the body placed in a casket and driven into Marietta. Once Frank's body reached Atlanta, thousands of citizens stormed the funeral parlor where his body lay and demanded to see the body. Some of the onlookers threw rocks through the windows until the parlor owner relented and allowed the denizens to enter peacefully. The next day, Lucille Frank escorted Leo Frank's body by rail from Atlanta to New York City, where relatives laid Frank to rest in Mount Carmel Cemetery in Glendale, Queens, New York, on August 20th, 1915. After the lynching, Jews in Atlanta left the city in a hurry. Many who remained assimilated into Southern culture further and denied Judaism. Tom Watson exclaimed in his newspaper, The Jeffersonian, quote, "The voice of the people is the voice of God," end quote. A grand jury assembled in Marietta, Georgia, to discover anyone who would come forward to point the finger at the executioners. The new governor, Nate Harris, who succeeded John Slayton, offered a $1,500 reward for information leading to the capture of the lynchers. No one stepped forward. It was later discovered that most of Marietta's elite were responsible for executing Leo Frank, including judges, sheriffs, and police officers. No one was ever brought to justice. On the afternoon of September 20th, 1911, a clear fall day in Midwestern terms, the quiet in a small section of the city of Colorado Springs, Colorado, seemed almost deafening. Miss June Ruth arrived at her sister's house
Mrs. Alice May Burnham, to complete some sewing. At that point in time, people still left their doors unlocked, and Miss Ruth knew she would have no difficulty entering the house. But before opening the door, though, she noticed the pungent smell of decay permeating the porch of the house. When Miss Ruth walked into the house, the smell sickened her, and when she went to look for her sister, she opened the door to the main bedroom, and that's when she made the horrible discovery. There she noticed, as one newspaper reported, quote, "the mangled bodies of her sister, niece, and nephew, their heads crushed to a pulp, lying on the bed covered in blood-soaked sheets," end quote. Miss Ruth immediately ran into the street, raising the alarm. But these were not the only victims. Neighbors ran to the Burnham residence as soon as they heard the news and went to notify the Burnham's neighbors, the Waynes. When citizens entered the Wayne residence, the same smell of decaying flesh strongly penetrated the nostrils of those inquiring into the house. Mr. Henry F. Wayne and Miss Blanche Wayne and their 1-year-old child lay sprawled on the couple's bed, their skulls crushed to where facial bones had caved in to the point of unrecognizability. Investigators at the scene surmised that the killer made his entrance through the back door of each house in a methodical manner and murdered the families as they slept. In addition to destroying the skulls of his victims, authorities also determined that the perpetrator used the blade of the instrument to cut the shoulders and other parts of the body as well. One observer noted, quote, "Wayne's head was battered and cut to pieces. The skull of the infant baby was crushed like an eggshell," end quote. After completing the slaughter, the killer covered the bodies with bloody clothing, then left the axe, bloodied and covered with brain matter, near the outside of the back door. The axe belonged to a neighbor, J.R. Evans, and Mrs. Burnham borrowed the axe the week before. When Mrs. Evans went to retrieve the axe on Monday morning, she noticed the blood stains all over the blade, but she thought nothing of it, thinking that Mrs. Burnham used the axe to cut the heads off chickens. The murder of the Burnhams and the Waynes left the police stumped. As meticulously as they combed the crime scene, the killer left no clue as to his identity, except a bloody handprint left on some curtains. Police also noticed that the intruder turned over a bottle of ink and gripped the axe with ink-soaked hands. However, the handprints were smeared and illegible enough for a fingerprint analysis. Fingerprinting became the mainstay for identifying criminals after it was accepted as a legitimate crime-fighting tool in 1910. But any other evidence the police determined was useless. Police immediately thought of Arthur J. Burnham, Mrs. Burnham's husband, as the culprit, as he was the only occupant of the house who escaped injury due to his absence. Arthur J. Burnham worked at a local sanitarium as a cook and had not been home for the last 2 weeks. Police picked him up for questioning and noticed that the tops of his shoes contained spots of what appeared to be blood. Investigators stated that they would make an analysis to see if the stains were really blood or some other substance. Police later released him when his supervisor and security officers at the institution confirmed his alibi. Authorities still believed that Burnham had something to do with the murders, and they suspected that the cook believed his wife to be having an affair with an Italian in the area, and, in a homicidal rage, murdered everyone he could find within the close proximity to his house. Detectives questioning the husband intimated that a man named Donatell visited Mrs. Burnham frequently and that she would soon give birth. How soon was never determined. Mr. Burnham stated that before he and Alice were married, Donatell was her suitor, and after the wedding, he became a trusted friend of the family. Finally, Burnham became enraged with his interrogators and bellowed, quote, "You are barking up the wrong tree. Stop wasting time on me and get the fellow who did this," end quote. On September 23rd, authorities released Burnham from jail. As the investigation into the Burnham and Wayne murders progressed, over 900 miles to the west, on October 2, 1911, a small number of a church congregation at the First Presbyterian Church in Monmouth, Illinois, noticed that their custodian had not been to work in a few days and decided to pay the absentee worker a visit to discover whether he was sick. When the church members arrived at the custodian's residence, they knocked, but received no answer. When they went to the rear door, they found it unlocked. As the visitors went into the bedroom, they discovered the bodies of Mr. and Mrs. William Dawson, and in the adjoining room, the body of their 13-year-old daughter, Georgia.
It appeared that each victim suffered from a single blow to the head, shattering their skulls. Each body was also wrapped neatly in a sheet, and the house appeared to be undisturbed. Authorities quickly ruled out robbery as a motive, as Dawson still had $40 in his pockets. When questioned, neighbors stated they heard no commotion whatsoever coming from the Dawsons' abode the night before. Since police ruled out robbery as a motive, they looked to the past of one of the victims in order to make sense of the slaughter. Investigators learned that Mr. Dawson had served time in prison for a lesser term due to his turning state's evidence against an accomplice, Chris Marzik. After serving his sentence in Joliet State Prison, Dawson reformed his life, met a woman, fell in love, and the two had a child. Dawson gave no indication that he reverted to his old ways, but when he left the prison, Marzik stated that he would get even, somehow. Police believed the accomplice to be the suspect they were looking for. Authorities resorted to summoning bloodhounds to the area to see if they would be able to catch the scent of the murderer. In addition to the canines, detectives from all over the area met in Monmouth to join the investigation. In order to aid the detectives and the bloodhounds, Governor of Illinois Samuel Deneen offered a $200 reward for information leading to the apprehension and capture of the person or persons responsible for the murder of the Dawson family, or information leading to the capture of, quote, the maniac, end quote, responsible for the deaths of the previous victims. Including the Dawsons, up to this point, the Midwestern Axman had already claimed 14 lives. On October 19, 1911, 533 miles away from Monmouth, Illinois, in Ellsworth, Kansas, Mrs. O.W. Snooks telephoned her neighbor several times and received no answer. After finishing her housework later in the day, Mrs. Snooks went to the Showman house again and discovered the door unlocked and walked in and found William and Pauline Showman and their 2-year-old son, Fenton, dead with their heads beaten in with an axe. Their heads were so disfigured that unless someone knew the family, they would not be able to identify the three. Within the same room, in another bed, Snooks discovered the rest of the family: Lester, 6 years old, and a 4-year-old girl, Fern. Fenton was laying across the dead body of his father, with the head of one of the other children mangled more than the rest of the 5. Authorities believe the murders took place between 12 and 3 o'clock on the Monday morning of October 16th, although they were hesitant to pinpoint the time exactly. George Showman, Will's brother, came to the house on Monday morning at approximately 7 a.m. to bring some milk to the household. He noticed nothing unusual. J.D. Johnson, a co-worker of Showman at the garage where he worked, drove up in front of the house and honked the horn, but received no response. So he drove off rather than waiting. When police searched the Showman household, they noticed an axe sitting behind the door that appeared to have been recently washed. Small stains of blood appeared on the handle. When investigators held up the axe to the light, they noticed several small pieces of curly hair. The sheriff of Ellsworth notified Abilene, Kansas, and requested the use of the bloodhounds, and they arrived later that day of the 19th. When the canines arrived, the first one used took a scent from a piece of cloth that the murderer allegedly wiped his hands after committing the murders. The dog followed a trail as far as the junction where the Frisco and Pacific Railroad tracks merged, then abruptly stopped. The police then brought this dog back to the crime scene and gave the search to the second dog. This dog took the same route and halted at the same spot. Police believe that the assailant walked from the crime scene to the crossing and caught the southbound train between 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning. Police also believe that Chris Marzik may have been responsible for this attack as well. It would appear that Marzik was the brother-in-law of Mrs. Pauline Showman. At the time of Marzik's incarceration, he and Mrs. Showman's sister experienced difficulties and his wife divorced him, marrying another man. It is said that Marzik stated, as reported earlier, he vowed to get even with not only the Dawsons, but also threatened to get even with his ex-wife's family. An alarm rose when it was reported that Marzik was spotted in Ellsworth just 24 hours before the murders, with the police having been alerted that he was a suspect in the Dawson murders. What investigators failed to clarify was whether authorities suspected Marzik in the Burnham and Wayne murders as well.
One of the witnesses who testified against Marzik at his trial for theft that sent him to the penitentiary, Marshall Merritt, stated that someone tried to break into his home and he strongly believed that Marzik the culprit. Investigators discovered that someone took a screen from a window at the Merritt residence, but then made no further effort to enter the residence. Harry Baker, the clerk at a local hotel, stated to police that a man matching the description of Marzik checked into the hotel under the name of, quote, John Smith, end quote, and stated that the man secured employment with a local mining operation. Baker also reported that he found a bloody shirt in the man's room after the murders had been committed and after the mysterious John Smith disappeared. As it turns out, a man named John Smith inquired about working at one of the mines, was offered work, but failed to return to start his employment. In order to expedite the apprehension and capture of the fiend responsible for the Showman murder, the County Commissioner Board offered $500, and Governor Walter R. Stubbs also offered another $500 to find the killer. A theory emerged regarding the Showman murders, as the axe killings in Monmouth and Colorado Springs were somehow connected. This was the first time in the history of the investigation that authorities believed an actual, quote, serial killer, end quote, may have been at work. As the investigation into the Burnham, Wayne, and Dawson murders progressed, on June 6, 1912, in a small yellow house that stood at 710 West Wea Street in Paola, Iowa, two neighbors of the Rollin Hudson family, Mrs. Sherman Stump and Mrs. C.J. Music, noticed that the house seemed unusually quiet. The two women walked around the wraparound porch that adorned the quaint little abode, peering into windows to see if they could notice any movement within the residence. As they stood before the drawn curtains of the bedroom, the two women called out to the family through the window. A third woman, hearing the other two neighbors yelling into the house, walked into the yard and pushed open the unlocked front door. As quickly as she opened the door and walked in, she closed the door brusquely behind her, slowly walked into the front yard, and fainted. The original two women who first investigated the Hudson house hailed down a man, Herman Hintz, traveling in a buggy past the house and coerced him to go into the Hudson residence. Hintz walked in slowly after walking through the door, the three women still standing outside. Hintz walked out after a few minutes, and his face was ashen. He cried out to the women, quote, "My God, they've been murdered," end quote. Hintz then ran up the street. Within no time, the citizens of Paola heard about the murders and began to gather around the Hudson residence. When authorities arrived a short time later, they determined that the Hudsons had been killed with a coal pick that investigators believed the assailant stole from a local rail yard. Investigators also determined that the perpetrator crushed the skulls of the victims with the instrument that they discovered. Mr. Hudson's skull was crushed so intensely that he was not recognizable, quote, the left side of the skull being torn away and a dozen other blows having rendered his head nothing but a bloody mass, end quote. Mrs. Hudson suffered from a blow to the left temple that tapered and caused death instantly. She also sustained gashes across the forehead, over the right eye, over the left eye that angled downward, that gouged out her eye. After the killer covered their bodies with a comforter, he then proceeded to bring down more strokes upon the dead couple's corpses. Investigators also deduced that the person that visited the Hudsons on Wednesday night before their bodies were discovered was well known to the family, as a meal had been prepared and photo albums opened and displayed. When police further investigated into the relations between the couple, one witness told them of a letter that Mrs. Hudson had received that she seemed, quote, breathless to open, end quote. When the couple went to visit the cemetery later that day, they quarreled viciously. A few hours afterwards, Mr. Hudson left a message for Mrs. Hudson that read, quote, well, I'm going to KC. Leave my clothes and those two pictures with Charlie. I will be back next fall and get them. You will not be bothered with me anymore. Goodbye. Rollin. End quote. The killer left no clue as to his identity, with the exception of something witnessed by one of the neighbors on the night that the murder allegedly took place. Mrs. Joseph Longmire stated a lamp hitting the floor of her small house awoke her from a dead sleep at approximately 12:05 a.m. And when she got out of bed, she spotted a dark figure running out of the back door of her house. Mrs. Longmire's 8-year-old daughter stated she witnessed a dark figure looking over the edge of her mother's bed at the time in question. Interestingly, a kimono belonging to Mrs. Hudson was found in the Longmire's dining room. The police took the evidence into custody. The Hudsons were last seen alive on the evening of Wednesday, June 5, 1912, by their neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. William Pryor, when both were seated on the couple's front porch. Mr. Pryor later told police that he witnessed a strange man in a dark suit walk onto the porch. Mr. Hudson then let the stranger into his home. Mrs. Pryor added that she did not notice whether the stranger left the Hudson house when she retired for the evening at approximately 10 p.m. In investigating the victims, police discovered that although the Hudsons had only been married for the previous 2 years, they experienced severe difficulties within their marriage, having been separated 3 times. When investigators uncovered this fact, they theorized that another man may have been involved with the murders of the Hudson family. With the series of crimes that took place over the last year, authorities formulated several theories as to the identity of the killer. The theory that seemed to gain the most traction was that the killer followed some sort of religious mission, punishing those he believed not worthy of living in God's world, or perhaps someone who did not deserve to live based upon their moral behavior. The reason police believed this to be the strongest suspect was that the murders held some similarities, and it appeared the signature of the killer matched substantially. Additionally, most of the victims attended church regularly. On the morning of Sunday, June 9, 1912, Ina and Lena Stillinger, the daughters of Joseph and Sarah Stillinger, left their home to attend church at the Villisca, Iowa Presbyterian Church. Later in the day, the church elders planned a children's program. After the morning service, the girls intended to have dinner with their grandmother, then attending the children's program at the church after services, then returning to their grandmother's to spend the night. However, one of their school friends, Catherine Moore, asked the girls if they would be able to spend the night. The girls received permission from their parents, and after the evening program, returned to the Moore household. Josiah B. Moore lived there with his wife and their 4 children: Herman, aged 11, Catherine, aged 9, Boyd, aged 7, and Paul, aged 5. The family returned from church at approximately 9:45 p.m. on the night of June 9th. On the following morning, Mrs. Mary Peckham, the neighbor of the Moores, awoke at approximately 4:30 on the morning of the 10th and went outside to complete her chore of hanging clothes on the line to dry between 5 and 6 a.m. Mrs. Peckham remembered that she saw the family leave for church the night before, but she went to sleep sometime around 8 p.m. and did not remember seeing them return home, and heard no noises coming from the house the night before. When Mrs. Peckham saw no sign of activity coming from the Moore residence, she walked over to their porch and attempted to wake the family. After this unsuccessful effort, Mrs. Peckham then went to the chicken coop and let the chickens out and checked on the other livestock. Mrs. Peckham then called the home of Ross Moore, Josiah's brother, to determine whether there were any problems with the family that would keep them from being in their home. Mrs. Peckham spoke with Jessie, Ross's wife, and Jessie stated that she would pass the information along to her husband. Later that morning, Mrs. Peckham witnessed Ed Selly, one of Mr. Moore's employees, visit the house to look after the livestock in the barn. After Selly completed that task, Ross Moore arrived with a key to get into the house. Mrs. Peckham stayed on the porch when Ross arrived at the house. At first, he tried looking in the window to see if he could notice any movement within the residence. Ross then entered the house and walked to the downstairs bedroom. To his horror, Ross opened the door to the bedroom and found 2 bodies covered with blood-stained sheets. Ross notified Mrs. Peckham to fetch the sheriff. When police and investigators arrived shortly thereafter, in the downstairs bedroom, they found the Stillinger sisters' heads crushed and horrendously mutilated. In the upstairs bedroom, investigators located Mr. and Mrs. Moore, their heads in a similar fashion as the Stillinger girls, with, quote, their heads crushed and almost severed from their necks, end quote. In an adjoining room, Catherine and Paul lay, their heads crushed as well. And still in another room, Herman and Lloyd, their craniums in the same condition as the other victims in the household. In the middle of the room containing the battered bodies of Herman and Floyd,
Authorities found an axe believed to be the only weapon used by the assailant who committed this unholy slaughter. From the appearance of the wounds on all of the bodies, it appeared that the perpetrator struck the victims as they slept with the sharp end of the axe first, then finishing his work with the blunt end of the instrument. Robbery was not the intended motive due to the undisturbed fashion in which he left the house. What perplexed investigators even further is that the killer must have had a key to the residence, as the door was locked from the outside. When asked as to whether Josiah J.B. Moore had any enemies, family members responded, no. J.B. was a respected businessman in the community. Montgomery County, where the murders were committed, offered a reward of $500, and the state of Iowa offered an additional award of $300 for the apprehension and prosecution of the person or persons responsible for the Villisca murders. Again, bloodhounds from a neighboring county were brought in, but to no avail. They lost the trail of the scent at the Nottoway River. The Midwest remained quiet for a time, and then, on September 27, 1912, the Midwestern Axman struck again. In Payson, Illinois, approximately 97 miles from Springfield, Illinois, and 16 miles outside of Quincy, Illinois, was located the farm of Charles Pfanschmidt. Authorities had been called out when Pfanschmidt didn't answer his door, and it appeared that a small fire had engulfed part of the farm. When police finally entered the scene, they found Charles Pfanschmidt, his wife, their 16-year-old daughter Blanche, and a lady later identified as Miss Emma Campen, a teacher and a friend of Miss Pfanschmidt, who had been visiting the family that evening, all dead. Unlike the other attacks, the perpetrator attempted to burn the house to conceal his crime. The Pfanschmidts received various wounds about the head and their bodies were burned, but not bad enough in 2 of the cases to exclude an identification. Upon examining the crime scene, investigators learned that the Pfanschmidts retired to bed early. The telephone lines appeared to have been cut, and the relatives of Miss Campen were unable to establish a telephone connection with which to speak to her. When the local sheriff requested bloodhounds, as in the previous cases, something interesting occurred. The bloodhounds led the authorities to Ray Pfanschmidt, Charles's son. Ray worked at a camp just outside Payson, Illinois, and the dogs led right to him. However, authorities did not believe the evidence strong enough to warrant an arrest. Authorities reevaluated the murder scene and ascertained that the assailant attempted to dismember the bodies and burn them in the stove. This is what caused the fire, but it did not engulf the entire cabin. It would appear that another long hiatus may occur and the killer's elusive behavior would keep him from detection. But while the investigations in the wheat belt continued, another crime near Columbia, Missouri, could provide a valuable link to all of the cases. On or about December 18, 1912, police responded to a call from the residence of Mrs. Georgia Moore and Mrs. Mary J. Wilson. Henry Lee Moore, Mrs. Moore's son, arrived at the home sometime around 3:45 p.m. after returning home to celebrate Christmas with his mother and grandmother. Moore tried the front door, but it was locked. He went around to the different windows to see if he could peer into them. After unsuccessfully attempting to enter, Moore went to the house of a neighbor of the 2 ladies named Mrs. Samuel Cornelson. When asked whether all the doors were locked, Mrs. Cornelson stated she had no idea why the house had been locked up so. Moore then went back to the house and tried the back door. He pushed it open, and when he finally walked into the house, he witnessed his mother lying on her back with a large cut from an axe across her forehead and her throat cut, quote, presumably with a knife, end quote. Moore dashed from the house without going any further inward and back to Mrs. Cornelson's residence and informed her that his mother had been murdered. The alarm sounded so that all the neighbors in the vicinity would contact the local authorities. When the police arrived, they found Mrs. Moore and then searched the premises for Mrs. Wilson. They found Mrs. Wilson lying on the bed in a pool of blood. On closer examination, Mrs. Wilson sustained a deep gash on the right side of her neck. The blow appeared to have cut off the lower part of her ear. This appeared to be the only blow she sustained. Her right hand was folded under her face, and her left hand was resting just beneath her chin. The angle of the cut demonstrated that the killer stood in front of the bed when he struck her. As far as Mrs. Moore, the position of the axe cut on her forehead indicated that, quote, This was made after she was on the floor, end quote. Police discounted robbery as the motive. After a coroner's inquest was held, authorities arrested Henry Lee Moore for the murders. After an in-depth investigation into the background of Henry Lee Moore, investigators discovered that Moore had been in prison for until as recently as May 1911, having been convicted of forgery. Prior to leaving prison, Moore wrote a letter to a 16-year-old girl named Queenie Nichols, where he professed his undying love for the teenager. Nichols rejected Moore outright, stating that he, quote, had no home of his own, end quote. Moore then told Nichols he would soon have his mother's house. He did not clarify how this would happen. During a subsequent interrogation, Moore stated that he finished college and received a degree from Kansas State Agricultural College 6 years prior to the murders, and traveled extensively through China and South America. When first questioned by the police, Moore gave conflicting statements as to why he appeared in Columbia, Missouri. In later discussions, Moore stated that once he arrived in Columbia, he registered at a local hotel under the name of, quote, L. Smith, end quote. He did this in an attempt to keep his mother from realizing he had come to town. Moore averred that he went to his room, then grabbed some dinner, returning to his room around 6 p.m. the night before the murder, and stayed there until the next morning. The whole time, Moore professed his innocence throughout the questioning. Moore had some small blood droplets on his shirt and explained that he had a nosebleed. Interestingly, Moore kept newspaper clippings of the case of Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen, the London doctor who allegedly poisoned his wife to take up with his mistress. Police also discovered, through his self-admission, that Moore had the habit of visiting morgues wherever he visited for work out of, quote, curiosity. Moore engaged 2 attorneys to assist with his defense, F.C. Finley and Ralph Harris, and they met with their client the afternoon of his arrest. The prosecuting attorney, E.C. Anderson, stated that he possessed enough evidence to convict Moore at the time of his arrest. Anderson's challenge was to prove motive through documentation rather than just the wild rumors circulating throughout the region regarding Moore. After his trial, conviction, sentence, and affirmed appeal, Sheriff Bert Sapp of Columbia, Missouri, brought Moore to the state penitentiary to begin serving his sentence. In May 1913, an astounding theory surfaced that identified Moore as a, quote, serial killer, end quote, even though the term had not yet been coined. M.W. McClary, the warden's son and special agent with the Department of Justice, proclaimed that Henry Lee Moore was responsible for 25 axe murders committed across the Midwestern United States throughout 1911 and 1912. Sometime after Moore's conviction, on a hunch, McClary sent Moore's fingerprints to J.H. Livingston, a fingerprint expert located in Jefferson City, Missouri. Livingston, quote, suggested, end quote, that Moore had something to do with the murders. The media at the time embellished these suspicions to the point that Moore was seriously being considered for the charges of murder in the previous cases, including the Moore family in Villisca, Iowa. McClary's theory was later discredited when the superintendent of the Kansas State Reformatory, M.F. Amrine, stated that he corresponded with Moore at the time of the murders, and Henry was in Columbia, Missouri at the time the series was committed. Back in Villisca, authorities tried the Reverend George Kelly as the only suspect who ever went on trial for the murders. After 2 trials, Kelly was acquitted, although Kelly had a penchant for writing obscene letters to women in an attempt to get them to type in front of him in the nude. Evidence suggested that Reverend Kelly had been in Villisca at the time of the murders, but scant circumstantial evidence failed to convict him. In May of 1927, the entire United States stood glued to their radios and watched for the daily newspapers. In the small town of Bath, Michigan, an explosion occurred that rocked the nation. But this was not just any explosion. This took place in a small elementary school where children and teachers perished. This was no accident. What would it take, or what kind of mind would cause someone to rain down so much destruction and death upon a small Michigan town? After the smoke cleared, authorities identified the perpetrator to this decimation as one Andrew Kehoe. Kehoe was born in Tecumseh, Michigan on February 1st, 1872, in a family of 13 children. After the death of his mother, Kehoe's father remarried, but Kehoe did not get along with his stepmother, often clashing over the smallest of provocations. At the age of 14, the family's kitchen stove exploded as his stepmother attempted to light it. Her body soon became soaked with fuel oil and she caught on fire. Kehoe waited a few moments before dousing the flames that engulfed his stepmother's clothing and her flesh. Mrs. Kehoe died a few days later from the burns she received, and stories tell that she experienced excruciating agony. Police investigated young Kehoe, but never charged him with the fire nor with the death of his stepmother. Kehoe later attended Tecumseh High School, then later left the farm to attend Michigan State College, later Michigan State University, where he met his future wife, Ellen Nellie Price, the daughter of a very wealthy Lansing, Michigan family. Nellie and Kehoe were married in 1912 and moved around until 1919, until they bought a 185-acre farm outside the village of Bath Township, Michigan. Surrounding neighbors got to know the Kehoes and seemed especially troubled when they characterized Andrew Kehoe as an intelligent man who grew impatient with those who disagreed with him. Although always dressed neatly and dapper, Kehoe was obsessive about his appearance and often changed his shirt at midday when the slightest amount of dirt soiled the material. Even as clean as Kehoe seemed, he hid a very dark side. Neighbors recalled that Kehoe treated farm animals especially harshly. In fact, one time, he beat a horse to death. The surrounding farmers were not impressed with Kehoe's farming abilities either. Kehoe tried to adjust machinery so that he would not exert any physical effort to see that the farm would be profitable. Because Kehoe exhibited a sign of thriftiness, his neighbors elected him treasurer of the local school board in 1924. When he won a seat on the school board, Kehoe complained that taxes in the area were way too high and even blamed them for the depressed financial condition his family experienced. What Kehoe failed to realize was that his farming skills left a lot to be desired and tried to do everything mechanically rather than using old-fashioned elbow grease. Constantly tinkering with his machinery, Kehoe failed to put his nose to the grindstone, so to speak, when it came to making a living as a farmer. In 1925, Kehoe became the clerk of the Bath Township, but did not win the election for that position that was held later. During this time, Nellie became very ill and appeared to be suffering from chronic tuberculosis. With her illness, transportation to the hospital and doctor's bills took their toll on the Kehoe budget. The Kehoes amassed a sizable debt which made mortgage and homeowners insurance payments almost impossible. The mortgage holder had already begun foreclosure proceedings against the Kehoes, and Andrew tried to find a way to relieve his family of the increasing debacle. Kehoe did have a plan, but history fails to recognize exactly when he devised this plan. In the winter of 1926, the school board requested that Kehoe perform some much-needed maintenance on the school. But in the summer prior to that request, Kehoe began purchasing vast amounts of surplus explosives and incendiary components. It was not uncommon for farmers to purchase small amounts of dynamite or pyritol, an incendiary developed during World War I. The farmers utilized these powerful weapons for excavations, and it was not considered out of the ordinary. Kehoe knew not to draw much suspicion to himself as he made purchases in different towns near Bath and at different times. As a member of the school board, Kehoe had unfettered access to the local elementary school, where he allegedly performed the repairs requested from the board. Several of Kehoe's neighbors later reported that they heard various explosions taking place around the farm, where Kehoe would just explain the disturbances away as he was clearing tree stumps. In the spring of 1927, The whole town of Bath, as well as people around the nation, soon discovered what Kehoe had been up to for the last year. One of Kehoe's responsibilities as the treasurer for the Bath schools was to hand out paychecks. In the second week of May 1927, when handing a paycheck to a school bus driver, Warden Keyes, he stated, "My boy, you want to take care of that check, as it is probably the last check you will ever get." Keyes thought the comment strange, as most of the children, teachers, and parents prepared for the summer break, which would occur in less than a month from that pay period. A teacher at the school, Miss Bernice Sterling, telephoned Kehoe later that week and requested if she could use a grove located on his property for a school picnic. Kehoe responded that if Miss Sterling wanted a picnic, she would better have it at once. Again, Kehoe's behavior sparked questions from the teacher amongst the other townsfolk, but nothing too suspicious ever surfaced. On or about May 16, 1927, Kehoe loaded the back of his car with old tools, nails, pieces of rusted farm machinery, digging shovels, and any other items that may produce shrapnel as a result of an explosion. After filling the back seat of the car with the various metal debris, Kehoe placed 2 large boxes behind the driver's side and placed a loaded rifle on the passenger seat. On that same day, Nellie Kehoe had been discharged from the hospital after one of her many bouts with tuberculosis. Weakened in her condition, she could not have protected herself from the danger that she later confronted. At approximately 8:45 on the morning of May 18, 1927, Kehoe's neighbors heard explosions that originated near the Kehoe farm. At approximately 9:45 a.m., citizens heard explosions coming from the direction of the elementary school, sending shards of metal and glass in every direction. Fires burned uncontrollably in both locations, and rescuers rushed to the school. One eyewitness, Bernice Sterling, recounted, "It seemed as though the floor went up several feet. After the first shock, I thought for a moment I was blind. When it came, the air seemed to be full of children and flying desks and books. Children were tossed high in the air, and some were catapulted high into the air." The damage to the school seemed apocalyptic, as the north wing of the school virtually collapsed from the effects of the blast. Walls obliterated, and a part of the roof had already fallen to the ground. Another eyewitness, Monty Ellsworth, noted the utter human destruction as a result of the blast. There was a pile of children of 5 or 6 under the roof, and some of them had arms sticking out. Some had legs, some just their heads sticking out. They were unrecognizable because they were covered with dust, plaster, and blood. There were not enough of us to move the roof. The scene at the school became even more chaotic as parents demanded to know the location of their children. When some parents did not receive any information, they discovered their child's lifeless bodies and wept openly. Immediately after the explosion and the quick extinguishment of the subsequent fires, more than 100 men dug the rubble to see if there was any sign of life. Many women joined the search as well, desperately pulling at mangled boards, bricks, and large pieces of plaster in assisting in the search for any missing children. An hour after the explosion, Kehoe drove up to the school, got out of his vehicle, and held a conversation with the school superintendent. Just then, witnesses saw Kehoe and the superintendent walk over to the former's car. Kehoe retrieved the rifle from the passenger side of the car, stood a short distance from the vehicle, then fired one shot into the back seat where the boxes of dynamite lay. At once, the car exploded, immediately killing Kehoe, the school superintendent, the postmaster, Glenn O. Smith, and Smith's father-in-law, Nelson McFerrin, a retired farmer. One child, Cleo Clayton, a second grader, happened to wander outside of the school where he survived the initial explosion, but shrapnel from the Kehoe car subsequently killed him. One of the mothers there, Mrs. Eugene Hart, sat on a small bank just a short distance from the school holding a little boy, with the bodies of 2 dead little girls on either side of her. In her shocked demeanor, Mrs. Hart would sit there with the children until rescuers brought the little boy to the hospital. He would eventually succumb to his wounds a short time later. O.H. Buck, the foreman of a local road crew, recalled that the scene appeared to be the end of the world. Buck and most of his men ran from the road to the location of the school to see if they could help the rescuers. The police stopped the searchers after they became concerned that other explosive devices had not been detonated and may still be in the school rubble. Therefore, the rescuers had to wait until more experienced law enforcement looked for the further devices. Calls went out to other areas for the assistance from doctors, law enforcement, area hospitals, and sadly, undertakers. A local physician, Dr. J.A. Crum, and his wife, a nurse, saw this type of devastation when the two served with the American forces on the Western Front during World War I. After the war, they returned to Bath, Michigan in order to open a pharmacy and became very friendly with the citizens there. After the explosion at the school, Dr. Crum and his wife set their drugstore up as a triage center, treating some cases and determining their seriousness. Most of the dead were brought to the town hall, which then became a morgue. Private automobiles were pressed into service as ambulances to bring the wounded to receive medical treatment. Later in the afternoon of May 18th, 13 ambulances arrived at the town hall to take the dead to local undertakers. People worked all day and night at the site of the school explosion searching for survivors. They noticed that several children were pinned underneath the debris. Area contractors sent men to assist with the search, along with architectural and mechanical engineers to determine whether any further explosive devices existed. In nearby Lansing, Michigan, they sent fire and police units to the area. By the middle of the day, 34 officers and firemen arrived to assist as well. Michigan State troopers directed traffic to and from the scene. Most of the injured and dying had been transported to the Sparrow Hospital in Lansing, Michigan. In the afternoon of the 18th, Michigan Governor Fred Green arrived on the scene and physically helped stack bricks that blew a great distance from the explosion. A local baking company donated pies and sandwiches to the rescuers, as most of them went the entire day without a meal. It proved that neighbors and fellow townships banded together to help during this most heinous tragedy. Subsequently, when law enforcement units arrived on the scene, they discovered an additional 500 pounds of explosives under the south wing of the school. The north wing was totally decimated. Thankfully, the 500 pounds did not detonate. This explosion was set to go off at the same time as the firebombs in the north wing, 9:45 a.m. Police surmised that had that bomb detonated, the dead and dying would have exceeded the present toll. Although this is no consolation to those who lost loved ones, the damage could have been worse. Authorities next turned their attention to the Kehoe Farm explosion as they realized that the city employee may have planned these actions prematurely. On the following day, sadly, law enforcement identified the charred remains of Nellie Kehoe, whose body was found amongst the ruins of the farm. Police noted that thousands of people walked by and did not notice that the burning embers were actually a human body. Further examination of the Kehoe property revealed that all the buildings had been destroyed through explosions. Again, sadly, the barn had been destroyed, and all of the animals that Kehoe secured within the structure perished as a result of the explosions and subsequent fires. Later assessment of what law enforcement believed to be Kehoe's motives for the bombings and fires, the lack of money and the payment of his mortgage. As they peered around the property, the unused equipment around the farm could have been sold off to pay off the Kehoe's arrearages. As authorities left the Kehoe property, they noticed a sign that Kehoe appeared to have posted when leaving the property the previous day. The sign read, "Criminals are made, not born." Over the next few days, multiple funerals occurred within the small farming community of Bath Township. After the smoke had cleared and a coroner's inquest took place, 39 children and teachers perished in the initial explosion at the school. Subsequent to the explosion, one fourth grader, Beatrice Gibbs, died later after receiving hip surgery to remove shrapnel as a result of the explosion. As a result of Kehoe's car explosion, 5 people perished. It was determined that Nellie Kehoe probably died during the explosion at the Kehoe farm. This brought the total number of dead to 45. The inquest determined that Kehoe murdered the school superintendent in the late morning and exonerated the school board of any culpability in the explosion, fires, and subsequent deaths. The inquest also determined that Kehoe gave no indications as to what he had planned. Kehoe's family claimed his body and buried him in a pauper's grave. Nellie Kehoe's family claimed her body and buried her in the Mount Hope Cemetery in Lansing, Michigan, under her maiden name, Price. After the bodies had been buried and the inquiries finally reached their conclusions, Governor Green set up a relief fund so that contributors could assist with the recovery of families devastated through Kehoe's most demonic plan. The school board formulated another fund for contributions to rebuild the school. When school resumed in the fall, on September 5, 1927, classes were held in the Bath Community Hall. The board voted to destroy the damaged part of the school. In 1975, 48 years after the travesty, a park was dedicated in honor of the victims. At the center of the park is the cupola of the building where the blast took place. A bronze plaque affixed to a white boulder bears the names of the victims. As for the infamy of Andrew Kehoe, history remembers this mass murderer as someone who could not accept that his failure stemmed from his own actions. He will forever be remembered as the Bath Township murderer, with the deaths of 45 innocent people affixed to his legacy.
We hope you enjoyed the second marathon for 2022. Don't forget, we have a drawing that is ongoing. If you want to know the details, I'll leave the link below so that you can check it out. If you like what you saw, hit the subscribe button, the like button, and the bell so that you won't miss any future programs. Also, please share us with your friends who enjoy historical crime renditions. If you feel like supporting the channel, and we hope you do during these times, we're on PayPal, GoFundMe, and buymeacupofcoffee.com. Additionally, we have a presence on Facebook, Twitter, Rumble, and now on TikTok. Until next time.